On a Saturday afternoon in July of 1054, a French cardinal named Humbert walked into the Hagia Sophia, the most sacred church in the Eastern Christian world. Afternoon prayers were about to begin. Hundreds of worshippers were gathered inside. But Humbert had not come to pray. He marched straight up to the main altar, placed a document on it that excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, turned around, and walked out. At the door, he shook the dust from his feet and shouted a Latin phrase that translates to, "May God see and judge." What happened next would tear Christianity apart for nearly 1,000 years. And here is the dark secret that most people never learn. When Humbert placed that document on the altar, the Pope who had sent him was already dead. He had been dead for 3 months. The excommunication that split the Christian world may have been completely invalid from the very start. Before we begin, we want to mention that everything in this video is based on our in-depth research from trusted sources. We have made every effort to ensure that our facts, from dates and names to key events, are as accurate as possible. However, if you notice any mistakes or have additional insights, please let us know in the comments so we can update our findings. The Great Schism. It is one of the most important and least understood events in all of Christian history. Most people know that Christianity eventually split into Catholics and Protestants during the Reformation. But 500 years before Martin Luther nailed his theses to a church door in Germany, Christianity had already been ripped in half. The Greek Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, two traditions that today claim a combined 2 billion followers worldwide, were once a single, unified faith. They shared the same creed, the same sacraments, the same Bible. So how did one church become two? What drove them apart? And why, after nearly 1,000 years, has the wound never fully healed? The answer is more surprising than you might think, because it does not begin with a dramatic theological showdown. It begins with a map. Back around 285 AD, the Roman Empire was the most powerful civilization on Earth. It stretched from northern England all the way down to the Upper Nile in Egypt. At its peak, the empire covered more than 5 million square miles. To put that into perspective, the entire United States is only 3.8 million square miles. Emperor Diocletian looked at this vast territory and came to a simple conclusion. It was too big. Too many borders to defend. Too many peoples to govern. Too many languages to manage. So he did something no emperor had ever done before. He split the Roman Empire into two halves, a western half with its center of power in Rome, and an eastern half which would eventually center on a city called Constantinople. This decision was purely administrative. It was about logistics, not ideology. Nobody at the time imagined it would have any impact on religion. But it set in motion a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. Because once you divide an empire, you divide its culture. And once you divide a culture, you begin to divide its faith. Over the following centuries, the two halves of the empire grew apart in almost every way imaginable. The West spoke Latin, the East spoke Greek, two completely different languages, which meant two different ways of reading scripture, two different ways of writing theology, two different ways of thinking about God. Western theology, rooted in Roman law, emphasized precision, structure, hierarchy, and clear definitions. Eastern theology, rooted in Greek philosophy, emphasized mystery, beauty, contemplation, and spiritual experience. Both sides were Christian. Both worshipped the same God. But they were slowly, almost invisibly, beginning to worship him in different ways. Now, in 330 AD, something happened that would reshape the Christian world forever. Emperor Constantine took an ancient Greek fishing village called Byzantium and transformed it into a breathtaking new imperial capital. He called it Constantinople, from the Greek words Konstantinos and polis, meaning city. Literally, the city of Constantine. Over the next 2 centuries, Constantinople grew into one of the greatest cities the world had ever seen. At its height, it had a population of more than 300,000 people. By comparison, the largest city in Western Europe at the time, Venice, had only 80,000. London had perhaps 30,000. Constantinople was not just a city, it was the city. The crossroads of the world, a hub of trade between Europe and Asia, a center of scholarship, art, philosophy, and most importantly, Christian worship. Visitors described streets lined with marble, forums decorated with statues from ancient Greece and Rome, and libraries containing manuscripts that existed nowhere else on Earth. And at its heart stood the Hagia Sophia, a cathedral so vast and so magnificent that when it was finally completed in 537 AD under Emperor Justinian, the emperor is said to have whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." Visitors said the Great Dome seemed to be suspended from heaven itself by a golden chain. Before Constantinople rose to greatness, the young Christian faith was fighting for its very survival from within. Not from Roman persecution, which had largely ended under Constantine. It was an internal crisis that threatened to destroy Christianity from the inside. In 325 AD, church leaders from across the Roman world gathered at the Council of Nicaea to confront a question so dangerous it had already caused riots in the streets of Alexandria. Was Jesus truly equal to God, or was he something less, a created being, powerful and exalted, but not divine in the same way the Father was divine? A charismatic priest named Arius had been teaching that there was a time before the Son existed, that Jesus was the first and greatest creation of God, but still a creation, not co-eternal, not equal. This belief, called Arianism, was spreading through the Eastern Church. It was not a fringe position. For a time, it was the majority view in parts of the empire. Entire regions of Christianity were Arian. If Arianism had won, the very concept of the Trinity as Christians understand it today would not exist. The stakes could not have been higher. The council responded by creating the Nicene Creed, a statement of faith meant to settle the question once and for all. It begins with the Greek word pisteuomen, which means "we believe." Every line was carefully chosen to establish what all Christians should hold to be true. 56 years later, in 381, church leaders gathered again at the First Council of Constantinople under the guidance of Emperor Theodosius I. They expanded the creed, adding a crucial clarification about the Holy Spirit. The creed stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and is equal to both the Father and the Son. This language drew from Scripture, particularly John chapter 15, verse 26, where Jesus tells his disciples that the Spirit of truth comes from the Father. At that moment, every Christian in the known world, East and West, Greek and Latin, agreed on these exact words. They were the foundation of a shared faith, but that agreement would not survive. Centuries later, the Western Church did something the Eastern Church would never forgive. They changed the creed, and they did it with a single word. By the 6th century, many Western theologians, writing and thinking in Latin rather than Greek, felt the original creed did not fully capture the relationship between the three persons of the Trinity. They believed the Holy Spirit did not come from the Father alone, but from the Father and the Son together. To make this explicit, they added one Latin word to the creed, filioque, which means "and the Son." So the creed no longer said the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. It now said the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. In 598, at the Council of Toledo in Spain, the Western Church officially adopted this addition. The addition was meant as a clarification to make the full divinity of Jesus even clearer. But when the Eastern Church found out, the reaction was fury. They had two devastating arguments to make. First, the question of authority. The creed had been written and approved at ecumenical councils, gatherings of the entire church. In 431, at the Council of Ephesus, church leaders had explicitly and unanimously forbidden any further revisions to the creed. The West changed it anyway, without calling a council, without consulting the East, without permission from anyone. For the Eastern Church, this was not just a theological disagreement. It was a fundamental violation of how the church was supposed to work. It was one branch of Christianity claiming the unilateral right to alter what the whole church had agreed upon. Second, the theology itself. The Eastern Church believed that the Father is the single source, the single origin of both the Son and the Holy Spirit. This preserved the unique primacy of the Father within the Trinity. In their view, Inserting the words and the Son confused the distinct roles of the three persons and undermined the Father's unique position. Western theology, deeply shaped by the writings of the great theologian Augustine of Hippo, saw things very differently. Augustine had taught that the Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son, and this view had become foundational to Latin Christian thinking over the centuries. Both sides could point to Scripture. Both sides were sincere, and neither side was willing to back down. A seemingly small change, one word in Latin, had created two enormous problems: a crisis of authority and a theological divide. And the gap between East and West would only continue to grow. What makes this so fascinating is that most ordinary Christians in both East and West had no idea any of this was happening. They went to church, they received communion, they prayed using the version of the creed their local bishop taught them. The theological wars were being fought by scholars, patriarchs, and popes, while the average believer simply lived their faith. But the decisions made in those council chambers and papal courts would eventually reshape the lives of billions. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, the Pope in Rome found himself in a dramatically new situation. With no emperor in the West, the Pope began to fill the power vacuum. He became not just a spiritual leader, but increasingly a political figure, a ruler of territories, a broker of alliances. In the East, the emperor in Constantinople still reigned, and the Church existed within the framework of imperial authority. These were two fundamentally different models of how Church and state should relate. In 482, Emperor Zeno and Patriarch Acacius of Constantinople attempted to resolve one of the era's most bitter theological disputes. Two camps within the Eastern Church were at war over the nature of Jesus Christ himself. The Chalcedonians held that Jesus had two distinct natures, both fully human and fully divine, united in one person. The Miaphysites maintained that Jesus had one united nature. To bridge this divide, Zeno and Acacius issued a document called the Henoticon, from the Greek word henosis, meaning union or unity. It was deliberately written in vague, careful language, avoiding anything that might provoke either side. But vagueness, it turned out, pleased no one. Pope Felix III in Rome saw the Henoticon as a dangerous compromise on essential doctrine. If you blur the lines of what Christians believe, he argued, you destroy the faith itself. In 484, he excommunicated Patriarch Acacius. This sparked what historians call the Acacian Schism, a split that lasted 35 brutal years before unity was finally restored in 519. 35 years where East and West refused to recognize each other. It was a clear warning sign. The bond between East and West could snap, and every time it snapped, it became harder to put back together. Each break left scar tissue. Each reconciliation was a little less complete than the one before. In the centuries that followed, the relationship continued to deteriorate. Emperor Leo VI of Byzantium caused a scandal by marrying 4 times, which violated Eastern Church law. The disputes over his marriages drew in both church and state, further muddying the line between spiritual authority and political power. Then came one of the most provocative acts in medieval history. On Christmas Day, 800 AD, Pope Leo III placed an imperial crown on the head of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and declared him Emperor of the Romans. Constantinople was outraged. In the eyes of the Byzantine Empire, there was already a Roman emperor, and he sat in Constantinople. He had an unbroken line of succession going back to Augustus Caesar. The Pope had just created a rival emperor out of thin air, a barbarian king who could barely read Latin. This was not merely a political insult. It was, the Byzantines believed, an act of schism within the empire itself. The creation of the Holy Roman Empire in the West, instead of drawing Christians closer together, pushed them further apart than ever. For the East, it confirmed their worst fear. The Pope was no longer content to be a spiritual leader. He wanted to be a kingmaker. Meanwhile, the donation of Pepin had granted the Pope control over large territories in central Italy, creating the Papal States. The Pope was no longer simply a bishop. He was now a head of state, commanding armies and governing lands. This transformation of the papacy into both a spiritual and secular power fundamentally changed the dynamics of Christianity. The Eastern Church looked at this development with growing alarm. In 867, another crisis erupted when Patriarch Photius of Constantinople was appointed without Rome's approval. But Photius was no ordinary patriarch. He was one of the most brilliant scholars of his age, and he was not afraid of Rome. He struck back by raising the filioque dispute as a weapon, formally accusing the West of heresy for altering the creed. For the first time, the filioque was not just a theological disagreement, it was being used as ammunition in a political war. Both sides issued excommunications. Although the immediate confrontation was eventually diffused, the distrust it created never went away. It hardened into something permanent. Every generation inherited the suspicions of the one before, and the list of grievances grew longer and longer. But here is something that most people overlook. The disputes between East and West were not only about grand theology and papal authority, they were also about the everyday practices of ordinary Christian life, things that may seem trivial to us but carried enormous symbolic weight at the time. The Western Church used unleavened bread for the Eucharist, flat and plain, like the bread of the Jewish Passover. The Eastern Church used leavened bread, risen bread, which they saw as a powerful symbol of the resurrection. To the East, using unleavened bread seemed like a denial of the resurrection itself. To the West, using leavened bread seemed like an abandonment of the tradition Jesus established at the Last Supper. A dispute about bread became a dispute about what communion actually means, and it did not stop there. The West required all priests to be celibate. The East allowed married men to become priests, though bishops had to be unmarried. The West baptized by pouring water over the head. The East insisted on full immersion, 3 times, once for each person of the Trinity. Even the way priests wore their beards became a point of contention. Eastern priests wore long beards as a sign of piety. Western priests were clean-shaven. It sounds almost comical. But each of these differences represented a deeper conflict about how to live out the Christian faith. Each side looked at the other and saw not just an alternative practice, but a corruption of the truth. By the middle of the 11th century, the situation had become a powder keg waiting for a spark. The spark came from an unexpected source: the Normans. Norman warriors had been conquering southern Italy, a region that had historically been under Byzantine influence and home to many Greek-speaking Christian communities. As the Normans took control, they forced these Greek churches to either close or adopt Latin practices. Greek priests were told to shave their beards, use unleavened bread, and submit to Roman authority. It was a humiliation that enraged Constantinople. In 1053, Patriarch Michael Cerularius of Constantinople struck back. He ordered every Latin church in Constantinople to be closed, every single one. And he did not stop there. He ordered that the consecrated unleavened bread used by the Latin churches be thrown into the streets and trampled underfoot. According to the historian J.B. Barry, the Patriarch's purpose was to cut short any attempt at reconciliation. This was not a negotiating tactic. It was a declaration of war. Pope Leo IX, who desperately needed Byzantine help against Norman invaders threatening southern Italy, sent a delegation to Constantinople led by Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida. It was a fateful choice. Humbert was born around the year 1000 in Burgundy, France. He had entered a Benedictine monastery as a teenager and had risen through the ranks to become one of the most powerful men in Rome. He was a formidable scholar, fluent in both Latin and Greek, and an expert on church law. But he was also arrogant, inflexible, and contemptuous of anyone who disagreed with him. He had already written tracts calling Eastern Christian practices heretical. One source records that he described Eastern Christians who allowed their priests to marry as being like prostitutes. This was the man the Pope chose to send as his ambassador of peace. He arrived in Constantinople not to seek compromise, but to demand submission. Emperor Constantine IX received Humbert warmly, hoping for a productive alliance against their shared Norman enemy. But Patriarch Cerularius refused to even meet the cardinal. He would not grant Humbert an audience. He would not dignify his presence. Weeks of frustration followed. Humbert grew angrier by the day. And then, on Saturday, July 16, 1054, during the celebration of the Divine Liturgy, with the church full of worshippers, Humbert and 2 other legates strode into the Hagia Sophia. They walked directly to the high altar and placed upon it a papal bull excommunicating the Patriarch and all who supported what Humbert called his folly. The bull was filled with accusations, some of them absurd. Among other charges, Humbert accused the Greeks of removing the filioque from the creed, when in reality the Greeks had never added it in the first place. It was Rome that had altered the original. Humbert then turned and marched toward the door. At the threshold, he and his companions shook the dust of the cathedral from their feet, and they shouted in Latin, "May God see and judge." He returned to Rome convinced he had won a great victory for the papacy. 4 days later, Patriarch Cerularius convened a synod. He burned the papal bull and he excommunicated Cardinal Humbert and his companions. Notably, Cerularius did not excommunicate the Pope himself or the Roman Church. It was a targeted response to specific individuals. But the damage was done. The lines had been drawn. And now, the dark secret. When Humbert placed that bull on the altar, Pope Leo IX had already been dead since April 19, 1054, nearly 3 months. Some historians argue that without a living pope, a papal legate has no authority to act. The excommunication that is traditionally seen as the moment Christianity split may have had no canonical validity at all. It may have been the unauthorized act of one furious man. And yet, it became the symbolic fracture point for 1 billion Christians. What makes this even more extraordinary is that at the time, almost nobody noticed. The chroniclers of the era did not record the events of July 1054 as a major turning point. Negotiations between Rome and Constantinople continued for decades. Eastern and Western Christians lived and worshipped side by side in many communities. When Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade in 1095, he did so partly at the request of the Byzantine emperor. There was no sense that the churches had formally split. The real schism was still taking shape, slowly and silently. And then came the catastrophe that made the division permanent. By the late 12th century, Latin merchants, particularly Venetians and Genoese, had become enormously powerful in Constantinople. They controlled much of the city's trade and flaunted their wealth. Resentment among ordinary Greeks had been building for decades. In 1182, that resentment exploded in a violent anti-Latin massacre. Thousands of Western Christians living in Constantinople were killed. The survivors who fled back to Western Europe carried with them stories of Greek cruelty and treachery. When, 22 years later, the armies of the Fourth Crusade found themselves at the gates of Constantinople, the memory of 1182 was still fresh. It did not excuse what came next, but it helps explain it. In 1204, the armies of the Fourth Crusade attacked Constantinople. Think about what that means. Christian soldiers who had taken holy vows to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control instead turned their swords on the greatest Christian city on earth. The story of how this happened is a tale of debt, greed, and betrayal. The Crusaders needed ships to reach the Holy Land. Venice offered to build a fleet for 84,000 silver marks. But when the Crusaders gathered in Venice, far fewer arrived than expected, and they could not pay. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, a man who was old and blind but possessed a ruthless cunning, saw his opportunity. Political turmoil in Constantinople provided a pretext. A deposed prince promised the Crusaders vast wealth if they would help him reclaim the throne. The Crusaders agreed. When the promised money did not materialize, they decided to take it by force. On April 13, 1204, the Crusaders breached the walls. What followed was 3 days of unspeakable destruction. They stormed through the greatest city in Christendom, looting everything in sight. Churches were ransacked. Palaces were stripped bare. The altars of the Hagia Sophia were smashed, and their gold melted down. According to the Byzantine historian Nicetas Choniates, who was an eyewitness, the Crusaders seated a prostitute on the patriarchal throne inside the Hagia Sophia, where she sang bawdy songs while soldiers drank and urinated on the sacred relics around her. Monks were slaughtered at their own altars. Nuns were assaulted. Priceless manuscripts and artworks, accumulated over 1,000 years by generations of emperors and scholars, were burned, stolen, or destroyed. The famous bronze horses that had stood at the Hippodrome for centuries were torn down and shipped to Venice, where they were mounted above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica. They remain there to this day. The total value of the loot was estimated at 900,000 silver marks. Some chroniclers noted this was 7 times the annual revenue of the entire Kingdom of England. The medievalist Sir Stephen Runciman wrote that there was never a greater crime against humanity than the Fourth Crusade. The Crusaders established a Latin empire in Constantinople that lasted until 1261, when the Byzantines finally managed to reclaim their capital, but the damage was permanent. The empire that had stood as a bulwark of Christian civilization for 1,000 years was now a hollow shell, stripped of its wealth, its art, its confidence, and its trust in the West. Some historians have argued that the Crusaders, by destroying Constantinople, effectively destroyed the shield that had protected Europe from Eastern invasion. They weakened the one power that could have held back the Ottoman Turks. And in 1453, the final chapter was written. Sultan Mehmed II, just 21 years old, laid siege to Constantinople with an army of 80,000 men and a fleet of over 100 ships. The Byzantines, reduced to a fraction of their former strength, could muster only about 7,000 defenders. After nearly 2 months of siege, on May 29, 1453, the Ottomans breached the Great Theodosian Walls that had protected the city for 1,000 years. Emperor Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor, died fighting on the walls. The Hagia Sophia, the church where Cardinal Humbert had placed his excommunication 4 centuries earlier, was converted into a mosque. The ecumenical Patriarch survived under Ottoman rule, but his authority was reduced to a shadow. He became, in effect, a subject of the Sultan. Far to the north, a new power was rising. Moscow, having embraced Orthodox Christianity centuries earlier, now declared itself the Third Rome. A monk named Philotheus wrote to the Russian Grand Prince, "2 Romes have fallen, the third stands, and there will be no fourth." Moscow claimed the mantle of leadership for all of Eastern Orthodoxy, reinforcing Eastern traditions and deepening the separation from the West even further. The center of Orthodox Christianity had shifted from the warm shores of the Bosphorus to the frozen rivers of Russia. Later events only widened the divide. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century fractured Western Christianity into dozens of new denominations, but it did nothing to bridge the gap with the East. If anything, it made the Catholic Church more defensive, more centralized, and less willing to compromise on questions of papal authority, the very issue that had driven the East away in the first place. For 911 years, the mutual excommunications of 1054 stood. Think about that number, 911 years. Roughly 40 generations of Christians grew up knowing nothing else but division. There were attempts to heal the wound. At the Second Council of Lyon in 1274, and again at the Council of Florence in 1439, leaders from both churches met and tried to find common ground. Both times agreements were signed. Both times the agreements collapsed. The people in the pews would not accept what the leaders at the table had negotiated. The distrust ran too deep. Then, in January of 1964, something extraordinary happened. Pope Paul VI traveled to the Holy Land, where he met Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras I on the slopes of the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. It was the first time a pope and a patriarch of Constantinople had stood face to face since 1438 at the Council of Florence. 526 years of silence, broken on the very hillside where Jesus had once prayed for his followers to be one. When journalists asked Patriarch Athenagoras why he had come, he answered with a warmth that disarmed everyone. He said, "To say good morning to my beloved brother, the Pope. You must remember that it has been 500 years since we last spoke to each other." On December 7, 1965, one day before the close of the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras jointly issued a historic declaration. They expressed regret for the offensive words, unfounded accusations, and reprehensible gestures on both sides. And then they did something that would have seemed unimaginable for nearly a millennium. They lifted the mutual excommunications. They committed them, in their own words, to oblivion. The schism itself was not healed. The theological differences remain. The question of papal authority is still unresolved. The filioque remains in the Western Creed, although recent popes have chosen to omit it when praying alongside Orthodox leaders, a gesture that the Metropolitan of Pisidia, one of the co-chairs of the ongoing Catholic Orthodox dialogue, has described as a sign of hope. In December of 2025, the Ecumenical Patriarch held a special ceremony commemorating the 60th anniversary of the lifting, calling Christian unity an imperative in our tumultuous times. The theological dialogue between the two churches continues to this day, producing what both sides describe as significant progress, even if full reunion remains distant, and signs of hope continue to emerge. In 2025, both churches celebrated Easter on the same day, April 20th. A small thing, perhaps, but symbols carry weight, especially when the original division started with something as small as a single word. It all began with one change, adding the Latin word filioque to the Nicene Creed, and the Son. 2 syllables. It seems so small, but that one addition ignited a conflict that has lasted centuries. A conflict about who has the right to define what Christians believe, about how much power any single leader should hold, about whether unity requires uniformity or whether faith can hold together despite difference. Early schisms cracked the foundation. Political power plays widened the gaps. The mutual excommunications of 1054 gave the split a date. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 gave it a wound that has never fully closed. And yet, underneath all the centuries of division, both traditions still carry the same ancient word at the heart of their faith. The word from the creed that was supposed to hold them together. Pisteuo, I believe. Not I argue, not I divide, not I condemn, I believe. Today, nearly 1.4 billion Roman Catholics and roughly 220 million Eastern Orthodox Christians share that word. They share the same Bible, the same baptism, the same belief that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. What they do not share, what they have not shared for almost 1,000 years, is communion. They cannot break bread together at the same table. And that, perhaps, is the deepest wound of all. Because it started with a disagreement about bread, and it may yet be healed by it. If you found this story fascinating, please hit subscribe and click the bell icon so you do not miss what comes next. We have many more stories like this waiting to be told. In a Vatican archive in the year 1440, a scholar named Lorenzo Valla sat hunched over ancient documents, comparing Latin texts with the precision of a forensic investigator. He was examining one of the most important documents in Christian history, the Donation of Constantine. The document that gave the Pope control over the entire Western Roman Empire. The document that had justified papal supremacy for 600 years. And as Valla worked through the text, analyzing verb tenses, checking vocabulary, cross-referencing historical records, he arrived at a conclusion that would shake Christianity to its core. The document was a forgery, a complete fabrication. The Pope's claim to temporal power, the foundation of the Papal States, the justification for centuries of political authority, all of it was built on a lie created by unknown forgers in the 8th century. But here is the even darker secret that most people never learn. The Donation of Constantine was not the only forgery. It was not even the most important one. And the story of how the Catholic Church was really created, the institutions and the power structures and the doctrines that 1.4 billion people follow today, is far stranger and more political than almost anyone realizes. Because the Catholic Church as we know it was not founded by Jesus Christ in 33 AD. It was not established by Peter in Rome. It was built piece by piece across 1,000 years through a combination of genuine faith, political calculation, theological debate, and deliberate fraud. This is the story of how an empire tried to control a religion, how forgers rewrote history to justify power, and how the largest Christian institution on earth was constructed by very human hands with very human motivations. If you are interested in the hidden history of institutions and the gap between what we are told and what actually happened, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what other topics you would like me to investigate. Your support makes these deep research projects possible. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. The year is 312 AD. A Roman general named Constantine stands at the Milvian Bridge just outside Rome, preparing for the battle that will determine control of the Western Empire. His opponent Maxentius has superior numbers. The odds are against him. And according to the historian Eusebius, writing decades later, Constantine sees a vision. A cross of light appears above the sun with the words inscribed, "In this sign, conquer." That night he dreams that Christ commands him to paint the symbol on his soldiers' shields. The next day, October 28th, Constantine wins the battle. Maxentius drowns in the Tiber River, and Constantine marches into Rome as the sole ruler of the West. Within months, he issues the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity throughout the empire. The persecuted sect becomes a protected religion. Churches that had met in secret can now build in public. Clergy receive tax exemptions. The emperor begins funding the construction of massive basilicas. Christianity has won. The question is, what kind of Christianity? Because in the year 312, there was no single unified Christian church. There was no pope in the sense we understand the term today. There was no agreed-upon Bible. There were dozens of competing versions of Christianity scattered across the Roman world, each claiming to represent the true teachings of Jesus, each with different texts and different leaders, and different understandings of who Christ was. The institutional Catholic Church, the centralized hierarchy with the Pope at the top claiming universal authority over all Christians, did not exist yet. What existed were local communities of believers, loosely connected, sometimes in conflict, with no clear structure of command. So if the Catholic Church was not founded by Jesus in 33 AD, and it did not exist in recognizable form in 312, when exactly was it created? And who created it? The standard story goes like this. Jesus chose Peter as the rock upon which he would build his church. Peter traveled to Rome and became the first bishop, the first pope. An unbroken line of succession connects Peter to the current Pope Francis, 266 popes across nearly 2,000 years. The institutional structure was established by Christ himself. This is not a fringe belief. This is official Catholic doctrine, defined at the First Vatican Council in 1870. The Pope has full, supreme power over the whole Church, a power which he can always exercise freely. But here is what the historical evidence actually shows. Jesus of Nazareth lived and died between roughly 4 BC and 30 AD. Those dates are as certain as ancient history gets. 2 Roman sources, Tacitus and Josephus, both writing within decades of Jesus' death, confirm that a man named Christus was executed under Pontius Pilate. The historical Jesus is not in serious doubt. What is in doubt is everything that happened after. The Apostle Peter probably was in Rome. Most historians, even non-Catholic ones, accept that. Archaeological excavations under St. Peter's Basilica in the 1940s found bones beneath the high altar. Bones that might belong to a 60 to 70-year-old man who died in the 1st century, bones wrapped in cloth with gold thread and purple dye suggesting high status. Pope Paul VI announced in 1968 that the bones had been identified as Peter's in a manner considered convincing. But the lead archaeologist who actually conducted the excavation, Father Antonio Ferrua, publicly stated he was not convinced. The chain of custody had been broken. The bones had been moved without proper documentation. The identification remains disputed. But even if we accept that Peter was in Rome, even if we accept that he died there, was he the Bishop of Rome in the institutional sense? Did a single centralized authority exist in 1st century Rome? The answer from historians is no. Paul's letter to the Romans, written around 57 AD, does not mention Peter at all. 1st Clement, written around 96 AD from the Roman Church, talks about presbyters in the plural, not a single bishop. Ignatius of Antioch, writing around 110 AD, advocated strongly for the model of one bishop per city, but he does not mention a bishop when writing to the Roman Church, unlike his letters to other cities. The scholarly consensus is clear. Rome probably did not have a single monarchical bishop until the mid-2nd century, more than 100 years after Christ's death. The institutional papacy as we know it did not exist in the apostolic era. It developed gradually, organically, as local churches began organizing themselves into hierarchies. By the year 200, most cities had a single bishop. By the year 300, those bishops were claiming authority derived from the apostles. But the Bishop of Rome was still one bishop among many. He was not yet the Pope. The man who changed that was not Peter. It was Constantine. When Constantine won the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, Christianity was still a minority religion, perhaps 10% of the Roman Empire, maybe 6 million people out of 60 million total. It was diverse and divided. Arianism, the belief that Jesus was created by God and therefore not fully divine, was spreading rapidly through the Eastern Empire. Some regions thought Jesus had one nature, others thought two. Some used Matthew's Gospel, others preferred John, others read texts that would later be declared heretical. Christianity was not unified. Constantine needed it to be. You cannot run an empire on a divided religion. So in the year 325, Constantine did something no Roman emperor had ever done. He called a church council, not the Bishop of Rome, not the Pope. The emperor. He summoned roughly 300 bishops to the city of Nicaea in modern-day Turkey. He paid their travel expenses. He hosted them in the imperial palace. And he told them to settle their differences and produce a unified statement of faith. Pope Sylvester I, the Bishop of Rome, did not even attend. He sent 2 presbyters as representatives. The council produced the Nicene Creed, the statement that Jesus is of one substance with the Father, fully divine, co-eternal, not created. Arianism was condemned. The dissenters, all but 2 of the 300 bishops, signed. This was the moment, more than any other, when Christianity became institutionalized. Not because Jesus founded an institution, not because Peter established a hierarchy, but because a Roman emperor decided that religious unity was a political necessity. Constantine did not create Christianity, but he absolutely transformed it. He took a loose network of communities and began turning it into a state religion with defined doctrine and centralized control. And the church leaders, grateful for imperial support after centuries of persecution, accepted the partnership. What Constantine began, his successors completed. In the year 380, Emperor Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, making Christianity the official state religion of Rome. The edict stated, "We order the followers of this law to embrace the name of Catholic Christians. But as for the others, since in our judgment they are foolish madmen, we decree that they shall be branded with the ignominious name of heretics." Suddenly, being the wrong kind of Christian was not just a theological error. It was a crime against the state. Pagan temples were closed by law in 391. Public and private pagan worship was banned in 392. The transformation was complete. The religion that began as a persecuted minority had become the persecuting majority, and the institutional Catholic Church, with the Bishop of Rome claiming increasing authority, was born not from Jesus's words, but from imperial politics. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your country or city in the comments. I am asking because this story played out very differently depending on where you were in the Roman world. If you were in Rome, you saw the Pope's power growing. If you were in Constantinople, you saw the Eastern Church developing separately. If you were in North Africa, you watched both sides argue while your local traditions got erased. Geography shaped this history. So let me know where you are watching from. It helps me understand the audience, and it builds this community of people interested in how institutions really work. Thank you. Now, if Constantine's political backing gave the Catholic Church institutional form, what gave the Pope power over other bishops? Because in the 4th century, The Bishop of Rome was important, but not supreme. The bishops of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem had equal or nearly equal status. The church was run by councils where bishops voted as peers. The Pope could not simply command obedience. So how did the papacy become the centralized monarchy it is today? The answer is forgery. In the middle of the 8th century, somewhere in the Frankish Empire, someone created a document called the Donation of Constantine. The document claimed to be a 4th century decree from Emperor Constantine himself. It said that after Pope Sylvester I cured Constantine of leprosy and baptized him, Constantine gave the Pope sovereignty over Rome, Italy, and all the regions of the Western Empire. He granted the Pope the right to wear imperial regalia. He declared that the Pope ranked above all other bishops, and even above the Emperor himself in spiritual matters. And he moved the capital to Constantinople so the Pope could rule Rome without imperial interference. Every part of this was fiction. Constantine was not baptized by Sylvester. He was baptized on his deathbed in 337 by an Arian bishop. He did not have leprosy. He did not grant the Pope any territories. The entire document was fabricated centuries after Constantine's death. But here is the crucial point. Nobody knew it was fake. For 600 years, from roughly 800 to 1440, the donation of Constantine was accepted as authentic. Popes cited it to justify their territorial claims. It was included in canon law. It became the foundation for the Papal States, the 16,000 square miles of central Italy that the Pope ruled as a political sovereign from 756 until 1870. 1,100 years of papal political power rested on a forgery. Lorenzo Valla proved it was a forgery in 1440 using textual analysis. The Latin was wrong. The vocabulary included words that did not exist in the 4th century. The document mentioned co-consuls who never actually served together. Valla's work was decisive. But the Church did not officially acknowledge the forgery until the late 16th century, more than 150 years later. And even then, the Papal States did not disappear. The Pope continued ruling territory until Italian unification in 1870. A lie, once institutionalized, becomes very difficult to undo. But the donation of Constantine was not the only forgery. It was not even the most important one. Around the year 850, another set of forgers, this time working in France, created an even more ambitious fraud. They produced a massive collection of church documents called the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals. The collection contained letters allegedly written by early popes from Clement I in the year 90 all the way to Gregory II in 731. More than 90 letters. Detailed instructions on church governance, episcopal authority, and the relationship between local bishops and Rome. The letters showed, or seemed to show, that papal supremacy was not a medieval invention. It went all the way back to the apostles. Popes had always held universal authority. Bishops had always appealed to Rome to settle disputes. This had been the structure from the very beginning. Except it had not. Of the 60 letters attributed to popes before the Council of Nicaea in 325, 58 were complete fabrications. 19th century scholars proved this by showing that the letters quoted extensively from texts written centuries after the popes supposedly lived. A letter allegedly from Pope Clement in the year 90 quoted a document written in the year 400. That is a rather impressive feat of prophecy. Once exposed, the forgeries were undeniable, but they had already done their work. They had been cited by popes, incorporated into canon law, used to resolve disputes for 3 centuries before anyone questioned them. When Gratian compiled his decretum around 1140, the foundational text of Catholic canon law, he included 313 quotes from early popes. All but 11 came from the forged Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals. The institutional structure of the Catholic Church, the centralized hierarchy with the Pope at the apex claiming authority over all bishops, was built substantially on fabricated documents. This is not anti-Catholic propaganda. This is acknowledged historical fact. Catholic historians admit the forgeries. The question is what it means. Did the forgers invent papal authority, or did they simply exaggerate what already existed? It depends who you ask. But what is undeniable is that the church we see today, the church with the Pope claiming universal jurisdiction, the church that can issue binding doctrinal statements and excommunicate dissenters, was shaped profoundly by deliberate fraud. In the year 1054, a confrontation that had been building for centuries finally exploded. On July 16th, Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida marched into the Hagia Sophia Cathedral in Constantinople during the Saturday afternoon service. Hundreds of worshippers filled the pews. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, was preparing the Eucharist. Humbert walked straight to the altar, placed a document of excommunication on the sacred table, turned around, and walked out. At the door, he shook the dust from his feet and shouted in Latin, "May God see and judge." 4 days later, the Patriarch convened a council and excommunicated Humbert in return. Christianity split into the Catholic West and the Orthodox East, a division that has lasted 971 years and counting. But here is the detail that almost nobody knows. The Pope who sent Humbert, Pope Leo IX, had died 3 months earlier on April 19, 1054. When Humbert placed that excommunication on the altar, he was acting without valid papal authority. The moment the Pope died, the authority of the legates ceased. Everything Humbert did in Constantinople may have had no canonical validity at all. The excommunication that split Christianity might have been legally worthless from the start. So why did it stick? Because the underlying tensions were real. The filioque controversy, the argument over whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone or from the Father and the Son, had been simmering for centuries. The West had unilaterally added the words and the Son to the Nicene Creed without calling a council or consulting the East. Rome claimed that the Pope could alter the creed. Constantinople argued that only an ecumenical council could change what an ecumenical council had established. It was a fight about authority as much as theology. Rome said the Pope was supreme. Constantinople said bishops were equals. Forgeries fueled Rome's claims. The donation of Constantine said the Pope ruled over all bishops. The pseudo-Isidorian decretals showed popes exercising universal jurisdiction since apostolic times. Except those documents were fake. The East knew they were fake, or at least suspected strongly, and Rome kept citing them anyway. The excommunications were officially lifted in 1965 by Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras I, 911 years later. But the schism remains. Catholics and Orthodox still cannot take communion together. The institutional division created by politics and forgeries in the Middle Ages persists into the 21st century. If the medieval church was built on forged documents and imperial politics, the Reformation was the moment when those foundations cracked wide open. By the early 16th century, the Catholic Church had become fantastically wealthy and fantastically corrupt. Popes led armies, bishops bought their offices, and the church sold salvation. Literally, it sold indulgences, certificates that promised to reduce your time in purgatory or the purgatory time of your dead relatives. In 1515, Pope Leo X authorized a massive indulgence sale to fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Half the proceeds in Germany were secretly diverted to pay off Archbishop Albert of Mainz, who had borrowed money from the Fugger banking house to buy multiple church offices simultaneously, a practice called simony that was explicitly forbidden by church law. The whole operation was a financial scheme. A Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel was hired to preach the indulgence. He became infamous for a phrase: "As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." Whether Tetzel actually said those exact words is debated. Martin Luther attributed the phrase to him. But accurate or not, it captured the reality. The church was selling grace for cash. Luther, an obscure theology professor at the University of Wittenberg, wrote 95 theses objecting to the practice. He posted them on October 31, 1517. Thesis 86 asked, "Why does not the Pope, whose wealth is today greater than the richest Crassus, build the Basilica of St. Peter with his own money rather than with the money of poor believers?" It was a fair question. The Pope was fabulously rich. The sale was justified by forged documents claiming papal authority, and the whole system was designed to extract money from the poorest believers to fund monumental architecture in Rome. Luther's protest ignited the Protestant Reformation. Within decades, half of Europe had left the Catholic Church. Not because Luther was a theological genius, but because the institutional church had become so transparently corrupt that millions of people were ready to abandon it. The Reformation forced the Catholic Church to reform. The Council of Trent, meeting from 1545 to 1563, explicitly outlawed the sale of indulgences for money. Clerical education was improved. Some of the worst abuses were curbed. But the centralized papal monarchy remained. In fact, it intensified. At the First Vatican Council in 1870, the Church declared that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra on matters of faith and morals, he is infallible, incapable of error. The same Church that had been built on forged documents, that had split Christianity over a questionable excommunication, that had sold salvation for profit, now claimed that its leader could not make mistakes. The irony was lost on no one. And the costs of that claimed infallibility are still being counted. In January 2002, the Boston Globe published the first in a series of investigative reports about sexual abuse by Catholic priests in the Archdiocese of Boston. The scandal that followed exposed a pattern of abuse and institutional cover-up that spanned the globe. The numbers are staggering. In the United States, the John Jay Report identified 4,392 priests accused of abuse between 1950 and 2002, roughly 4% of all clergy. More than 10,000 victims came forward. By 2025, credible allegations reached over 16,000. The Church has paid more than $5 billion in settlements. At least 30 dioceses have filed for bankruptcy. In Australia, the Royal Commission found that 7% of all Catholic priests between 1950 and 2010 were alleged perpetrators. In Germany, an independent study identified 1,670 accused clergy and 3,677 victims, calling these lower estimates. In France, the CIASE investigation estimated 216,000 children abused by clergy between 1950 and 2020, with the total rising to 330,000 when lay church workers are included. That is not a scandal. That is an institutional catastrophe. And the cover-up was systematic. Bishops routinely transferred accused priests to new parishes rather than reporting them to police. The Vatican issued instructions in 1962 requiring secrecy in abuse cases under penalty of excommunication. When the Archdiocese of Dublin took out insurance against abuse claims in 1987, it proved the institution knew what was happening and chose to protect itself rather than victims. The same church that claimed moral authority to guide 1.4 billion people, the same church that declared its leader infallible, spent decades enabling predators and silencing victims. Pope Francis has apologized. Reforms have been implemented. Transparency has improved. But the fundamental question remains: how can an institution that claims divine foundation and infallible leadership produce such sustained, systematic evil? The Catholic answer is that the Church is holy even when its members are sinful, that human corruption does not invalidate divine truth. The historical answer is that the Church was never divinely founded in the first place. It was built by humans, with human motivations, using human methods including deception and violence. And the abuse crisis is what happens when an institution claims it cannot be wrong. Today, the Catholic Church is the wealthiest religious organization on earth. The Vatican Bank reported 32.8 million euros in profit in 2024, managing 5.7 billion euros in client assets, a clear sign of its wealth. The Church owns approximately 4,234 properties in Italy and another 1,200 in London, Paris, Geneva, and Lausanne. The exact total wealth is unknown because the Vatican does not disclose full financial statements. Estimates range from tens of billions to hundreds of billions depending on how you value art, real estate, and historical artifacts. The global institutional budget runs over 1 billion euros annually. This is the same church that began with a Jewish carpenter in the 1st century in Galilee, who told his followers to sell their possessions and give to the poor, who said it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. The same church preaches humility and service while sitting on one of the largest concentrations of wealth in human history. The contradiction is obvious. But contradictions have never stopped institutions from claiming authority. The Catholic Church today governs 1.4 billion members, roughly 17.7% of the global population. It operates thousands of schools and hospitals. It provides humanitarian aid in crisis zones. It preserves art and history. It offers community and meaning to hundreds of millions of people. These are real contributions. The Church is not purely a force for harm, but it is also not what it claims to be. It was not founded by Jesus Christ. It was not established by divine command. It is a human institution that evolved across centuries through politics, theology, genuine faith, and deliberate fraud. The dark secret is not that the Catholic Church is evil. The dark secret is that it is ordinary. It is what happens when people try to institutionalize the teachings of a wandering preacher who left no written records and founded no organization. It is what happens when emperors need religious unity for political control. It is what happens when forgers rewrite history to justify power. It is what happens when an institution claiming infallibility refuses to admit its mistakes. So, who really created the Catholic Church? The answer is everyone and no one. Jesus of Nazareth inspired a movement. Peter and Paul spread that movement through the Roman world. Constantine gave it legal protection and institutional form. Theodosius made it a state religion. Leo I formulated the theology of papal supremacy. Gregory I expanded papal administration. Anonymous forgers in the 8th and 9th centuries fabricated documents to justify claims of universal authority. Pope after pope built on those foundations, sometimes with genuine faith, sometimes with political ambition, often with both. The Protestant reformers forced changes by leaving. The modern popes have tried to reform the institution while preserving its core claims. And 1.4 billion Catholics today participate in an institution that is simultaneously ancient and constantly evolving, both divinely inspired and profoundly human, a source of comfort and a source of harm. The story we are told is simple. Jesus founded the Church on Peter. Peter went to Rome. An unbroken chain of popes has led the Church for 2,000 years. The story the evidence reveals is far more complicated. A movement gradually institutionalized over centuries. An emperor transformed a minority religion into a state apparatus. Forgers created fake histories to justify present power. A schism followed an excommunication issued by men whose authority had expired. A reformation was sparked by the sale of salvation. A modern crisis of abuse was enabled by claims of institutional infallibility. And through it all, billions of people found meaning, community, and faith within an institution built by very human hands. The Catholic Church was not created by any one person. It was constructed piece by piece, century by century, through a combination of faith and politics, devotion and deception, spiritual yearning and temporal ambition. That is the dark secret. Not that the Church is uniquely evil, but that it is entirely human, built through human methods, sustained by human effort, and subject to all the corruption and failure that human institutions inevitably produce. The question is not whether the Catholic Church was created by divine command. The evidence strongly suggests it was not. The question is whether an institution built on such thoroughly human foundations can still offer transcendent truth. That is a question history cannot answer. It is a question of faith. And faith, unlike history, does not require evidence. If this investigation into how institutions really develop interested you, please share this video with someone who would appreciate it. And let me know in the comments what other historical topics you want me to research. The gap between official stories and actual history is often wider than we imagine. Thank you for watching.
In the center of Paris stands a building that consumed 2 centuries to complete. Notre Dame Cathedral rises 69 meters above the Seine, its Gothic towers visible across the city. Construction began in 1163 under a man who should never have possessed such power. No one has built anything remotely comparable since. The reason has nothing to do with declining faith or changing architectural tastes. The world that made Notre Dame possible was destroyed by plague, the Reformation, and the systematic extinction of the knowledge required to build such structures. What replaced it reveals something troubling about what we have lost. Bishop Maurice de Sully was born to peasant farmers in the village of Sully-sur-Loire around 1120. His parents were poor. His prospects were limited. Medieval society offered few paths for advancement to those born without wealth or title. The church was one. Maurice was intellectually gifted. He studied at the cathedral school in Paris, where his abilities attracted attention. He rose through church ranks through talent rather than family connection, an unusual trajectory in an era when most bishops came from noble families with estates and political influence. By 1160, Maurice had become Bishop of Paris. He controlled the wealthiest and most politically significant diocese in France. He was different from his peers. Most bishops focused on administration and politics. Maurice was obsessed with building. In 1160, Paris was becoming the intellectual and political center of France. King Louis VII was consolidating royal power. The University of Paris was attracting scholars from across Europe. The city's population was growing, but its cathedral was inadequate. The old Romanesque structure that had served Paris for centuries was small, dark, and architecturally outdated. Maurice saw an opportunity. He could build something that would define Paris for centuries. He could create a monument that would establish the church's permanence and power at the moment when royal authority was expanding. He could build the greatest cathedral ever attempted. Maurice obtained backing from King Louis VII in 1163. The king recognized the political value of supporting such a project. Pope Alexander III visited Paris that spring and agreed to lay the foundation stone during Easter celebrations. The timing was strategic. Easter represented resurrection and renewal. Beginning construction during the holiest week of the Christian calendar signaled divine approval. On the Ile de la Cité in the center of Paris, visible from both banks of the Seine, Maurice staked out the cathedral's boundaries. The design was audacious. The main structure would measure 128 meters in length and 48 meters wide at the transept. The nave would soar 35 meters high. 2 bell towers would rise 69 meters. The building would accommodate 9,000 people when packed for major ceremonies. Nothing in France approached this scale. Maurice was attempting something unprecedented. He hired the best master masons available. These men possessed knowledge of geometry, engineering, and structural mechanics transmitted orally through guild traditions. They had served 7-year apprenticeships. They understood how stone behaved under load, how arches distributed weight, how foundations must be designed for stability. Their knowledge was empirical rather than mathematical, accumulated through generations of trial and error. Maurice gave them an impossible task to build a structure taller and more luminous than anything previously achieved and make it last forever. Construction began immediately. Workers excavated foundations into the bedrock of the Ile de la Cité. Limestone was quarried near Paris and transported by boat along the Seine. The construction workforce exceeded 1,000 people. Master masons commanded the project. Journeyman masons performed skilled cutting and placement of stone. Laborers transported materials and mixed mortar. Carpenters built scaffolding and prepared timber for the roof. Glaziers created stained glass windows. Metalworkers forged iron reinforcement. The entire enterprise operated as a permanent construction site that would outlive everyone working on it. Maurice visited the site regularly during construction, making decisions on details that ranged from stone selection to window design. He worked directly with the master masons, refining plans as the structure rose. The project consumed his attention completely. He had responsibilities as bishop, administering the diocese and managing church property, but building Notre Dame became his life's work. He understood that he would not live to see completion. The scale guaranteed that, but he could establish the vision and ensure the work continued after his death. The materials came from across the region. The timber roof required approximately 5,000 oak trees, each 300 to 400 years old at harvest. Every beam was hewn from a single tree using axes and adzes. The forest that built Notre Dame's roof had been growing since before Charlemagne. Lead for the roof weighed more than 210 tons, cast into over 1,000 plates and installed by hand. The scale of material consumption was staggering. Salisbury Cathedral in England, built during the same period, required 70,000 tons of stone, 3,000 tons of timber, and 450 tons of lead. Notre Dame was larger. The financial model that sustained this construction seems alien to modern economics. The project cost $1 billion in current value. That money came from multiple sources over the 2 centuries of construction. Maurice contributed from episcopal funds. The Bishop of Paris controlled vast property holdings that generated rental income. King Louis VII contributed royal funds as a display of piety and power. Wealthy individuals purchased burial rights within the cathedral, donating portions of their estates for the privilege of being interred beneath the floor. Indulgences provided another revenue stream. Pope Urban IV offered remission of sins to those who donated to cathedral construction. The practice would later fund St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, raising over 100,000 florins through indulgence sales. Pilgrimages would bring offerings once the cathedral possessed important relics. Guilds and merchant organizations made corporate donations. The money flowed in steadily, but never fast enough. The first Mass in Notre Dame was celebrated in 1182, 19 years after construction began. The building was far from complete, but enough structure existed to hold services. Maurice presided over the ceremony. The king attended. Nobles from across France witnessed the event. Worshippers stood in a space unlike anything that had existed in Paris before. The nave soared upward. Colored light fell through windows that were still being installed. The scale dwarfed the congregation. This was what Maurice had envisioned, a space that made humans feel small and directed their attention toward heaven. In 1239, King Louis IX transferred the crown of thorns to Notre Dame in a procession that became legendary. Louis had purchased the relic from the Emperor of Constantinople for 135,000 livres, more than half the annual royal revenue. The procession through Paris to Notre Dame involved the entire court. Louis carried the crown himself, walking barefoot to demonstrate humility. The event established Notre Dame as the spiritual center of France. Maurice de Sully died in 1196, 33 years after laying the foundation stone. He was approximately 76 years old. The cathedral was perhaps 1/3 complete. The main structure was rising, but decades of work remained. The western facade had not been started. The bell towers existed only in plans. The elaborate sculptural program was barely begun. Maurice had devoted the last 33 years of his life to a building he would never see finished. He left detailed instructions for continuation. He had trained a generation of craftsmen. He had established the funding mechanisms, but the cathedral was his vision, and he died without seeing it realized. The work continued. Other bishops followed Maurice. Other master masons took command. The construction site operated continuously through the 13th century. Workers lived and died without seeing completion. The structure was not finished until 1345, a span of 182 years from foundation to completion. Walking into Notre Dame before the 2019 fire revealed what that money and those 182 years created. You entered through the portal of the Last Judgment on the western facade. The doorway was carved with scenes of souls being weighed and sorted, paradise on one side and damnation on the other. The stone figures were so detailed that you could see expressions on medieval faces, terror and joy carved by craftsmen who had been dust for 700 years. Inside, the nave stretched forward 130 meters. The stone columns rose 35 meters to ribbed vaults that seemed to float without support. The effect was intentional. Gothic builders wanted to create the illusion that stone could defy gravity, that the building was ascending toward heaven through pure faith rather than engineering. First-time visitors stopped walking and looked up, disoriented by the scale. The rose windows dominated the transepts. The north rose window measured 12.9 meters in diameter and contained most of its original 13th century glass. Medieval glaziers had created colors that modern chemistry cannot duplicate. The blue in particular, called Chartres blue, after the cathedral that perfected it, resulted from a glass-making process that was never written down and was lost when the craftsman died. Standing beneath the north rose on a sunny morning, with colored light falling across the stone floor in geometric patterns, visitors experienced what medieval worshippers had experienced. Before the fire, 12 to 13 million tourists visited Notre Dame annually, more than any other monument in Paris. They came to see what $1 billion and 182 years of labor had created. The construction techniques were sophisticated beyond what most people imagine when they think of medieval building. Notre Dame was the earliest Gothic cathedral to use iron reinforcement extensively. This was only discovered after the 2019 fire exposed the structure beneath the stone. Iron staples bound blocks together throughout the building, a technique that builders kept secret and that was lost after the Gothic era ended. The use of iron allowed thinner walls and taller structures than stone alone could support. The engineering was empirical rather than mathematical, but it was engineering nonetheless. Builders understood load distribution, structural redundancy, and material properties through accumulated experience rather than formal theory. Notre Dame represented the peak of a building boom that transformed Europe. The Gothic style had emerged in northern France just decades earlier. The Abbey of Saint-Denis, completed in 1144, had demonstrated new techniques. Pointed arches distributed weight more efficiently than rounded Roman arches. Flying buttresses allowed walls to rise higher and thinner. Ribbed vaulting created soaring interior spaces. Massive windows filled these spaces with colored light. The combination was revolutionary. Within 50 years, construction had begun on 87 major Gothic cathedrals across France alone. The resources devoted to cathedral building exceeded anything else medieval society attempted. A groundbreaking 2012 academic study examined the economics of Gothic construction in the Paris Basin between 1100 and 1250. During this 150-year period, 21.5% of the regional economy was devoted to church construction. Over 1,400 Gothic churches rose in this single region during this time. Imagine if modern society devoted 1/5 of its entire economy exclusively to constructing religious buildings. That was the scale of commitment that medieval civilization made. The timeline of Gothic cathedral construction reveals the system at its peak. Chartres Cathedral, one of the finest Gothic structures ever built, was reconstructed in just 26 years after a devastating fire in 1194. The building that stands today was completed by 1220, a speed never matched for a cathedral of comparable size and sophistication. The rapid construction resulted from concentrated royal and papal support, exceptional organization, and the alignment of resources at a moment when the Gothic style had matured, but the system that built cathedrals had not yet begun to fail. Amiens Cathedral took 49 years. Reims Cathedral took approximately 90 years. York Minster in England required 252 years. Cologne Cathedral in Germany took 632 years from foundation to completion, though construction stopped entirely for nearly 400 years during that span. A medieval crane stood atop Cologne's unfinished South Tower for 4 centuries, becoming a symbol of interrupted ambition. The reason the system failed can be stated in 2 words: Black Death. The plague arrived in Europe in 1347. Within 5 years, between 30 and 60% of Europe's population died. The mortality varied by region, but no area was spared. The economic consequences were immediate and catastrophic for cathedral construction. Labor became scarce. The survivors could demand dramatically higher wages. English lords saw their income contract by 20% between 1347 and 1353, while skilled craftsmen became expensive and difficult to find. Construction at Norwich Cathedral stopped abruptly on June 25, 1349. Work did not resume until 1355. The ambitious expansion of Siena Cathedral was permanently abandoned. The new structure would have been the largest in Italy. Construction stopped in 1348 when the Black Death arrived. The unfinished nave walls still stand today, incorporated into other buildings. The expansion was never resumed. Beauvais Cathedral began construction in 1225 with ambitions to exceed every existing structure. The choir reached 46.3 meters, the tallest ever attempted. The vaults collapsed in 1284. The rebuilt choir stood, but the transept was never completed. A crossing tower added in 1569 immediately collapsed. Today, Beauvais consists of a choir and transept with no nave. The building stands frozen at the moment collapse made completion impossible. Westminster Abbey's twin western towers remained unbuilt for 500 years until completion in the 1740s. Ulm Minster began in 1377, stopped in 1543, and was not finished until 1890. The demographic collapse destroyed the financial model of cathedral construction. A project requiring 21.5% of regional GDP could only be sustained when population, productivity, and economic growth aligned. The Black Death broke that alignment permanently. The labor shortage made construction prohibitively expensive. French historian Georges Duby captured the transformation. As the power of the church and nobility waned, so did the willingness to contribute both time and money. The Reformation delivered the second blow. Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517, attacking indulgences as corrupt practices that exploited believers. Indulgence sales had been a primary funding mechanism for cathedral construction. The Protestant Reformation eliminated this funding source across Northern Europe. Protestant reformers destroyed altars, smashed statues, and broke stained glass windows in cathedrals across Germany, England, and the Netherlands. Building new Gothic cathedrals became not just economically impossible, but theologically objectionable. In England, Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries between 1537 and 1542 stripped cathedrals of accumulated wealth. Durham Cathedral was stripped of its wealth between 1537 and 1538. The economic engine that had sustained cathedral construction for 4 centuries was systematically dismantled. The resources existed. The population eventually recovered. But the willingness to devote 21.5% of regional GDP to building Gothic churches never returned. The Renaissance shifted cultural values. Classical architecture from Greece and Rome became the prestige style. Gothic was dismissed as barbaric. Florence Cathedral's dome, completed by Brunelleschi between 1420 and 1436, marked the decisive shift. It was celebrated as a triumph of human reason over medieval superstition. Professor Stephen Murray of Columbia University described the cultural transformation. The church lost its position as the sole arbiter of knowledge and truth, and the Gothic cathedral lost its role as a symbol of this knowledge and truth. The cathedral had represented more than religious faith. It embodied the medieval understanding of the universe, with its soaring vertical space directing attention toward heaven, its structural logic reflecting divine order, and its decoration teaching scripture to an illiterate population. The Renaissance offered a different worldview, one centered on human achievement and classical learning. The cathedral became obsolete as a symbol even before it became obsolete as architecture. The guild system that transmitted cathedral building knowledge began declining during the Reformation and ended with the French Revolution. In 1791, France abolished guilds entirely. The 7-year apprenticeships that trained stonemasons disappeared. The techniques for cutting stone, carving decoration, mixing mortar, and engineering vaults were lost within a generation. Modern apprenticeships last only 3 years. Joe Alonzo, master stonemason at Washington National Cathedral, spoke about this loss. Andy, Sean, and I are not able to pass on our skills to the next generation, breaking a tradition at the cathedral since construction began in 1907. The classical parts of the trade are harder to come by. We are now in our 50s. What do we have left? 15 years or so? This generation cannot let this slip, or it may be too late. The knowledge required to build Gothic cathedrals is dying with the last generation of traditionally trained craftsmen. The political barriers multiplied. The rise of nation-states redirected resources from religious monuments to secular power. The French Revolution exemplified this shift. Notre Dame was vandalized during the Revolution. The cathedral was converted to a temple of reason. The building served as a warehouse. The gallery of king statues on the facade were beheaded because revolutionaries thought they represented French monarchs. They actually depicted biblical kings, but accuracy mattered less than symbolism. For decades after the Revolution, Notre Dame deteriorated. The roof leaked, stone crumbled, statues fell. By the 1840s, serious discussion centered on whether to demolish the cathedral entirely. The building occupied valuable land in central Paris. The structure was damaged beyond easy repair. Many argued for demolition and replacement with something modern. One man saved Notre Dame. Eugene Viollet-le-Duc was 30 years old in 1844 when he won the commission to restore the cathedral. He was an architect and historian who had studied medieval building techniques. He believed Gothic architecture represented French cultural achievement and that Notre Dame specifically embodied centuries of French history. He convinced the government that restoration was possible and necessary. He secured funding. He spent the next 23 years rebuilding Notre Dame. Viollet-le-Duc's restoration was controversial. He did not simply repair damage, he reimagined the cathedral as it might have been if construction had continued through the 14th and 15th centuries. He added elements that never existed in the original design. The famous spire that burned in 2019 was Viollet-le-Duc's creation, added in the 1860s. The gargoyles that tourist photograph are mostly 19th century additions. He was not restoring Notre Dame to historical accuracy. He was completing Maurice's unfinished vision according to his own interpretation. The decision was strategic, not scholarly. Viollet-le-Duc understood that Notre Dame needed to be spectacular to justify its preservation. A merely accurate restoration of the damaged 13th century structure would not inspire public support. An enhanced cathedral with a dramatic spire and elaborate decoration would become a tourist attraction and symbol of French culture. He was right. The restored Notre Dame became one of the most famous buildings in the world. Victor Hugo's novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, romanticized the building. The cathedral that Maurice built and Viollet-le-Duc saved became central to French national identity. Viollet-le-Duc died in 1879, his restoration complete. Notre Dame had been transformed from a crumbling medieval relic into a celebrated monument. The cathedral endured by becoming something its builder never intended, exactly like Biltmore would a generation later. Modern construction faces barriers medieval builders never encountered. Building codes regulate foundation depth and window size. Environmental regulations govern stone quarrying. Labor laws mandate working conditions. The permitting process alone would take years and cost millions. At least 1,600 of France's 40,000 religious buildings are closed due to disrepair. Estimates suggest 2,500 to 5,000 French churches may be demolished by 2030. The nation that built 87 major Gothic cathedrals cannot maintain the buildings it already has. Each cathedral requires millions in annual maintenance. The money must compete with schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. The comparison to modern construction reveals what changed. SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles cost $6.75 billion. Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas cost $2.33 billion. Cowboys Stadium in Dallas cost $1.2 billion. These are the cathedrals of modern America, monuments to professional sports rather than religious faith. The St. Louis Federal Reserve explicitly drew this parallel. Sports stadiums are often compared to the medieval cathedral in their attempt to dominate the skyline and inspire civic pride. Joseph Campbell observed that if you want to see what a society really believes in, look at what the biggest buildings on the horizon are dedicated to. Medieval Europe built cathedrals, modern America builds stadiums, societies invest resources in what they value. The priorities have shifted entirely. Yet one cathedral is still under construction. The Sagrada Familia in Barcelona has been rising since 1882. Antoni Gaudí began work on a design that combined Gothic structural principles with Art Nouveau decoration and organic forms inspired by nature. Gaudí died in 1926 with the project barely begun. The Spanish Civil War destroyed many of his plans and models. Construction continued through the 20th century, slowly and with many interruptions. The expected completion date is now 2026, marking 144 years of construction. The cumulative cost approaches 480 million euros, roughly $520 million. This is less than one major American football stadium. The annual construction budget exceeds 60 million euros, funded entirely by donations and entrance fees from the 4.8 million tourists who visited in 2024. The Sagrada Familia survives as a tourist attraction that generates its own revenue. It is not funded by a community devoting 21.5% of regional GDP to construction. The Notre Dame fire in 2019 revealed what restoration costs when disaster strikes. On April 15th, fire broke out at 6:18 p.m. The 750-ton spire collapsed at 7:53 p.m. after burning for approximately 90 minutes. The fire burned for 15 hours in total. 2/3 of the medieval timber roof was destroyed. 3 holes opened in the stone vaulted ceiling. The damage was catastrophic, but could have been worse. All 3 rose windows survived. The main structure remained standing. Sacred relics were rescued. The bells were saved. The restoration cost approximately 846 million euros, roughly $928 million. The work employed between 1,000 and 2,000 workers from 250 companies. Approximately 1,000 to 2,500 oak trees were harvested from 175 French forests to rebuild the roof. Each tree was valued at approximately 15,000 euros. Traditional hand-hewn beams were cut with medieval pattern axes. Many workers belonged to Les Compagnons du Devoir, a revival of medieval guild traditions that trains craftsmen in traditional techniques. The restoration took 5 years. Notre Dame reopened on December 7, 2024, with approximately 40 heads of state attending the ceremony. The speed was remarkable, faster than the original construction of comparable sections. Louise Bossière, a restoration craftsman, explained what made it possible. Making it in 5 years was hard. They had to do it. There was no choice. They took photos and looked at archives and made it exactly the same. The techniques, the visuals, the aesthetics, everything was exactly the same. It was easier today because of technology. American carpenter Hank Silver, who worked on the restoration, reflected on the original builders. Traditional carpenters had a lot of that in their heads. It is pretty amazing to think about how they did this with what they had, the tools and technology they had at the time. The restoration demonstrated that skilled craftsmen still exist. The techniques can be relearned. The work can be done. But only in response to disaster, not for new construction. Society will spend nearly $1 billion to repair something built 800 years ago. It will not spend that money to build something new in the same style. Who owns Notre Dame today? The question reveals a transformation at the heart of the cathedral story. The cathedral belongs legally to the French state under the 1905 law separating church and state. The Catholic Church uses it for services but does not own it. The French government maintains it, and it resents the cost. Tourists generate no direct revenue. Admission is free. The building sits in legal and financial limbo that would astonish Maurice de Sully. The restoration after the 2019 fire created immediate conflict. President Emmanuel Macron promised completion in 5 years, an aggressive timeline that required extraordinary effort and funding. He announced an international design competition for a modern replacement spire. Architects proposed glass, titanium, and contemporary designs that would mark the 21st century contribution. Public fury forced abandonment of the plan. The French demanded exact replication of Viollet-le-Duc's 19th century spire. Macron retreated. Restoration. The funding model exposed deeper problems. 846 million euros came from private donations, not government budgets. Wealthy donors contributed millions, often specifying exactly how their money could be used. Bernard Arnault, France's richest man, pledged 200 million euros. The Bettencourt family pledged 200 million euros. Francois Pinault pledged 100 million euros. American donors contributed over $57 million. The donors gained influence over restoration decisions. The government controlled the cathedral legally, but depended on private wealth to maintain it. Donations. The Catholic Church found itself sidelined from decisions about its own cathedral. The Archbishop of Paris could suggest liturgical requirements, but could not control construction choices. The French Ministry of Culture made final decisions based on historical preservation standards and donor preferences. Church. The descendants of the original builders have no connection to the cathedral. Maurice de Sully left no family that claims inheritance. The master masons who built Notre Dame trained apprentices who trained successors through generations, until the guild system collapsed. That transmission ended. The craftsmen who restored Notre Dame after the 2019 fire learned their skills from modern training programs that attempt to recreate medieval techniques. They are not the spiritual descendants of the original builders. They are technicians replicating work they admire but do not fully understand. Continuity. The Vanderbilt descendants still live at Biltmore, maintaining connection to George's vision even as the house operates as a business. Notre Dame has no equivalent continuity. The building stands. It functions. Tourists visit. Services occur. but the cathedral has been severed from everyone who built it, everyone who conceived it, and everyone who originally gave it purpose. Severed, the question is whether this represents loss or progress. The argument for progress is straightforward. Gothic cathedrals consumed enormous resources to create buildings that served limited practical purposes. The same stone, timber, and labor that built Notre Dame could have built housing for thousands of people. Medieval society devoted 21.5% of its regional gross domestic product to building churches, while most people lived in poverty and died young. The misallocation of resources was staggering. Modern society distributes construction budgets more rationally. We build hospitals for healing, schools for education, housing for shelter, and transportation infrastructure for commerce. The craftsmanship of Gothic construction was remarkable, but it was also wasteful. Hours of skilled labor went into carving stone decoration that most people could barely see. Progress, the argument for loss is more complex. Gothic cathedrals represented collective achievement on a scale that modern individualistic societies rarely attempt. When medieval communities devoted 21.5% of regional gross domestic product to church construction, they were making a collective decision about priorities: loss. The decision may seem irrational by modern economic standards, but it created buildings that have served their communities for 800 years and will likely stand for centuries more. Modern commercial buildings are designed for 50 to 100-year lifespans. We do not build for permanence. The craftsmanship embodied in Gothic cathedrals represented knowledge accumulated over generations. Master masons understood structural principles that were not written down and could not be taught from books. When cathedral construction ended, that knowledge began to disappear. The empirical understanding of how stone behaves under different loads and stresses, developed through centuries of trial and error, has been largely lost. The cultural loss may be the most significant. Gothic cathedrals were community projects that spanned generations. Workers who laid foundation stones knew they would never see completion. They worked anyway, creating something that would serve future generations they would never meet. The psychology of such long-term thinking seems alien to modern culture. We optimize for quarterly returns and immediate gratification. The idea of starting something that will take 2 centuries to finish is almost incomprehensible. At least 90 major Gothic cathedrals survive across Europe. Most have permanent restoration teams because the maintenance never ends. York Minster employs 24 stonemasons full-time. Salisbury Cathedral had scaffolding in place for 37 years during external restoration. The cathedrals survive as museums, tourist attractions, and active churches. But no new cathedrals are being built in the Gothic style. The final question is whether it could begin again. Could modern society build a cathedral like Notre Dame if it chose to do so? The technical answer is yes. The knowledge still exists in diminished form. Training institutions teach traditional stonemasonry. Organizations like the Cathedrals Workshop Fellowship at Canterbury, Durham, and York preserve techniques. Computer-aided design could model Gothic structures. Modern materials could replicate historical appearance. The physical capability exists. The economic answer is more complicated. A new Notre Dame would cost billions of dollars. The construction time would still span decades. The building would serve limited practical purposes. The same resources could build hospitals, schools, or housing. Democratic societies struggle to justify such spending when immediate needs go unmet. The cultural answer is the most difficult. Building a cathedral requires collective commitment across generations. It requires communities to value permanence over flexibility, beauty over efficiency, and the distant future over the immediate present. It requires accepting that most workers will die before completion. It requires faith, not necessarily in religious terms, but faith in the value of creating something that transcends individual lifetimes. Modern individualistic culture struggles with such long-term collective thinking. The knowledge is dying. Joe Alonso warned that his generation cannot pass on traditional skills. Modern apprenticeships are too short. The guild system is broken. Each year, fewer people possess the understanding required to build cathedrals. The capability is disappearing not through deliberate choice, but through neglect. Standing before Notre Dame today, visitors see a building that took 182 years to construct, survived 800 years of history, burned catastrophically, and was restored in 5 years through extraordinary effort. The Restoration demonstrated that modern society retains some capability to maintain Gothic cathedrals, but it also demonstrated the limits. The Restoration cost nearly $1 billion and required mobilizing craftsmen from across Europe. The effort was only possible because Notre Dame is irreplaceable, a World Heritage Site whose destruction shocked the global community. No such effort would be mounted for a new construction. We will preserve what our ancestors built. We will not build new cathedrals ourselves. The cathedral stopped rising not because we lost the ability or the wealth, but because we lost the will. We choose to spend billions on stadiums that will last 50 years rather than cathedrals that would last 1,000. We choose efficiency over permanence, utility over beauty, and immediate returns over generational investment. These are not necessarily wrong choices, they are simply different choices that reflect different values. The Gothic cathedrals remain as monuments to a worldview we no longer share. They stand as evidence that past societies made different calculations about what mattered. They survived because they became museums, preserving not just buildings, but the record of what humans once chose to build when they were building for God rather than profit. Whether modern society is richer or poorer for abandoning such projects remains an open question. We have gained much in practical efficiency. We may have lost something harder to quantify in collective ambition and permanence. The cathedrals will outlast us, silent witnesses to capabilities we no longer exercise and values we no longer hold. Rome, October 1517. Rome. A Dominican friar stands in a marketplace. His voice carries across cobblestones. Behind him, a wooden cross bearing papal arms rises against the autumn sky. A banner hangs, bright red silk catching the light. This is Johann Tetzel, and he is selling something invisible: forgiveness, relief from punishment. Years, centuries even, removed from the flames of purgatory. Not for you, perhaps your mother suffers there. Your father, a child lost too young. For a price, a few coins, you can ease their torment. Listen to him speak. Do you not hear the voices of your dead parents and friends beseeching you and saying, "Pity us, pity us. We are in dire torment from which you can redeem us for a pittance"? The crowd leans in. This is theater, this is commerce, this is theology twisted into salesmanship. And every coin that drops into the locked chest, guarded by a fugger banker with the only key, funds something else entirely. Miles away in Rome, stone climbs toward heaven. The largest church in Christendom rises on the bones of an older sanctuary, and it rises on money pulled from the pockets of German peasants who believe they are purchasing salvation. Beautiful, yes. St. Peter's Basilica, when complete, will be magnificent. But that magnificence has a price. Not just in gold, in fracture, in the breaking of Western Christianity itself. The Protestant Reformation begins here, in the gap between what the church promised and what men like Tetzel sold. If you want to understand how one building could shatter religious unity that had held for 1,000 years, stay with me. This is not a simple story of corruption. It is darker and more complex than that. Please like and subscribe. Your support makes these deep investigations possible. Tell me in the comments what other controversial histories you want explored. Let's begin. Rome, October 1517. The friar's voice fades, but the mechanism he represents continues. Across German territories, across Europe, indulgent sellers work their routes. The campaign is systematic. When sellers arrive in a town, preparation begins days ahead. Officials coordinate with local clergy. Printing presses produce certificates, blank forms with ornate borders, and space for a name to be filled in. On the appointed day, a procession forms. Priests in vestments, monks, the town council, school children with candles and flags. All the bells ring. Organs play. The indulgence cross is carried on silk or golden cloth and erected in the church. The papal banner is hung. And then the selling begins. The structure is tiered. Prices vary by social rank. Kings and archbishops pay 25 gold florins. Merchants with income over 200 florins pay 3 florins. Artisans pay 1 florin. Those with lesser means pay half a florin. Those with no money at all. Prayer is free, though whether prayer alone grants the indulgence is left carefully vague. Behind the ceremony, mechanics run with precision. A fugger clerk accompanies the indulgence seller at all times. The clerk holds the key to the collection chest. When opened, the contents are split according to prior agreement. For the German campaign run by Archbishop Albert of Brandenburg, the split is half and half. Half goes to repay the massive debt Albert owes the Fugger banking house for bribes paid to Rome for his appointment. Half goes to Rome specifically to fund the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. The Fuggers take their cut as well, approximately 3% commission plus profits from currency exchange. 100 ducats become 140 guilders in their hands. The money flows. From villages to regional centers, from regional centers to Augsburg, where the Fugger bankers tally accounts, and from Augsburg to Rome, where Pope Leo X presides over the greatest construction project in the Christian world. But what exactly are people buying? The theology is subtle. Most buyers do not grasp it. An indulgence, according to Catholic doctrine, is not forgiveness of sin. Sin must first be confessed and absolved by a priest. The guilt is removed through the sacrament of penance. What remains is temporal punishment, the consequences of sin that linger even after forgiveness. In Catholic teaching, these consequences must be satisfied, either through acts of penance in life or through suffering in purgatory after death. The treasury of merit doctrine, formally defined by Pope Clement VI in 1343, held that Christ's infinite merits, being more than sufficient for humanity's redemption, created a surplus. To this surplus were added the prayers, penances, and sufferings of the Virgin Mary and the saints, who had lived lives of such holiness that their merits exceeded what they needed for their own salvation. This spiritual treasure, the doctrine taught, belonged to the Church. The Pope, as keeper of the keys, could dispense from this treasury to benefit the living and the dead. It was elegant theology. It was also convenient theology. It gave the institutional church a product to sell that cost nothing to produce. Unlike land or gold, the treasury never depleted. Every indulgence granted drew on an infinite reserve. There were no production costs, no scarcity, no limit to potential sales. It was, in modern terms, a perfect business model, high margin, infinite inventory, emotionally compelling value, and a customer base conditioned by faith to trust the seller's claims. The system had been used before. Crusade indulgences in the 12th and 13th centuries promised full remission of punishment for those who took up arms to retake Jerusalem. Later, indulgences funded hospitals, bridges, and other civic works. But the St. Peter's campaign was different in scale and duration. This was not a one-time emergency appeal. It was a sustained, professionalized sales operation spanning decades and targeting the entire Catholic world. The machinery was too efficient. It extracted too much. And eventually, someone noticed. The Church claims the power to reduce or eliminate temporal punishment by drawing on the treasury of merit, a spiritual reservoir of grace built up by Christ's infinite merits and the prayers and good works of saints. An indulgence grants access to that treasury. A plenary indulgence removes all temporal punishment. A partial indulgence removes only a portion. The system had been evolving for centuries, formalized in the 13th century as crusades gave way to other uses. By the early 16th century, indulgences were routine. Popes granted them for various acts, pilgrimage, prayer, charitable works, and financial contributions. The innovation under Leo X was scale and focus. The indulgence campaign for St. Peter's was aggressive, sustained, and tied directly to funding a building. The problem was the preaching. Men like Tetzel did not bother with theological nuance. Tetzel, a Dominican friar from Saxony, had been selling indulgences since at least 1502. By 1516, he was subcommissioner for Archbishop Albert's territories. Witnesses reported his claims. One said Tetzel boasted that even if a man had violated the Virgin Mary, the Pope's indulgence could forgive it for the right sum. Another recorded Tetzel's pitch for indulgences on behalf of the dead. The famous phrase, whether Tetzel spoke it verbatim or not, captures the essence. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. That teaching was not official doctrine. The Sorbonne condemned it in 1482 and again in 1518. Cardinal Cajetan, examining Martin Luther later, would explicitly reject it. But Tetzel taught it, and people believed it. They believed they were buying their dead relatives out of torment. They believed the church had that power and was exercising it in exchange for money. And every coin they gave, half went to repay an archbishop's debts to bankers. The other half went to Rome to build a church. St. Peter's. Stand back for a moment and ask why it needed to be built at all. The original basilica, Old St. Peter's, had stood for over 1,200 years. Emperor Constantine commissioned it between 319 and 333 AD, built directly over the traditional burial site of St. Peter, the apostle martyred in Rome under Nero. It was a 5-aisled church over 350 feet long with a timber roof that soared past 100 feet. For a millennium, it served as Christendom's symbolic heart. Popes were crowned there. Pilgrims journeyed from across Europe to pray at Peter's tomb. By the 15th century, the building was dying. 12 centuries of weather, fire, the Saracen raid of 846 that damaged Peter's tomb, and simple structural fatigue had taken their toll. Walls leaned 6 feet off vertical. Timber rotted. The structure was beyond repair. Pope Nicholas V recognized the crisis in 1447 and commissioned designs for a new apse, but work stopped when he died in 1455. The question lingered for 50 years. Repair was impossible. Demolition seemed sacrilegious. The building was holy ground, yet it was collapsing. Pope Julius II made the decision. Julius, called Il Papa Terribile, the terrible pope, was a warrior and a patron. He wanted a monument. His own tomb, designed by Michelangelo, would require a setting of matching grandeur. In 1503, he commissioned an architectural competition. Donato Bramante won. Bramante, already architect to the papal court, proposed a Greek cross plan, a centralized church with 4 equal arms radiating from a massive central dome. The vision was bold. The execution would take 120 years. On April 18, 1506, Julius II laid the foundation stone under the pier dedicated to St. Veronica. That same day, he authorized the first indulgence for the construction of St. Peter's. From the start, the project was linked to indulgence revenue, but it was Pope Leo X who intensified the campaign. Leo, born Giovanni de' Medici, became pope in 1513. He was cultured, refined, and extravagant. He spent lavishly on art, music, and entertainment. He also inherited a treasury strained by the wars and building projects of Julius II. Leo needed money. St. Peter's needed money. On March 31, 1515, Leo issued the papal bull Sacrosanctus, dramatically expanding the indulgences campaign. The bull authorized sales across much of Europe with explicit language. The proceeds would fund the basilica. Regional bishops and archbishops were granted authority to organize sales in their territories. They could keep a portion of the revenue for local projects, or, in Albert of Brandenburg's case, to service personal debt. Rome would receive the rest. The mechanism was in place. The salesman went to work. And in the German territories, Johann Tetzel became the face of a system that would soon face its reckoning. The construction itself was a marvel and a burden. Bramante began with demolition. Sections of the ancient basilica were pulled down to make room for the new structure. The decision was controversial even then. Bramante earned the nickname Maestro Ruinante, Master Destroyer, for tearing away 12 centuries of history. But Julius insisted. The new must replace the old. Bramante's design called for 4 massive piers to support the central dome. Each pier was monumental, thick enough to contain spiral staircases and small chapels within its mass. Stone came from quarries in Tivoli and other sites near Rome. Travertine and marble were hauled by cart and barge. When Bramante died in 1514, the central piers were complete to the cornice. Raphael took over, modifying the plan to a Latin cross, extending a nave westward for greater capacity. When Raphael died in 1520, the project passed to Antonio da Sangallo the Younger. Sangallo strengthened foundations and built a massive wooden model of his proposed design. The model alone cost thousands of ducats. During Sangallo's tenure, annual construction costs ran approximately 162,000 ducats. That figure gives a sense of scale. A ducat was a gold coin roughly equivalent in purchasing power to $150 to $200 today, though direct comparisons across centuries are fraught. Still, the math is staggering. In a single year under Sangallo, costs reached the equivalent of perhaps $24 to $30 million in modern terms. And the costs never stopped. From 1556 to 1561, construction halted entirely. The papal treasury was empty. Leo X's extravagance, wars in Italy, and the spreading Reformation had drained Rome's revenue. Indulgence sales, once lucrative, were falling. Northern Europe, where Tetzel and others had operated most aggressively, was breaking away. Protestant territories rejected indulgences as unbiblical fraud. The Reformation, sparked in part by opposition to funding St. Peter's, was now cutting off the funds St. Peter's required. Work resumed when money could be found. In January 1547, Pope Paul III appointed Michelangelo Buonarroti as chief architect. Michelangelo was 71 years old. He accepted reluctantly and refused payment, claiming he undertook the work only for the love of God and in honor of the apostle. He returned to Bramante's Greek cross plan and designed the iconic dome. For 17 years until his death in February 1564, Michelangelo shaped St. Peter's. The dome's drum was nearly complete when he died. Giacomo della Porta and Domenico Fontana finished it in 1590, completing the dome in just 22 months using 800 laborers working day and night. In November 1593, the bronze sphere and cross were placed atop the lantern. The dome, rising 136.57 meters to the top of the cross, became the defining silhouette of Rome. Carlo Maderno extended the nave eastward, completing the facade in 1612 and the main structure in 1615. Gian Lorenzo Bernini added the baldacchino, the great bronze canopy over the papal altar, from 1624 to 1633. He designed St. Peter's Square with its sweeping colonnades between 1656 and 1667. On November 18, 1626, exactly 1,300 years after the consecration of Constantine's Basilica, Pope Urban VIII consecrated the new St. Peter's. The final documented cost, recorded by architect Carlo Fontana in his 1694 volume Templum Vaticanum, was 46,800,052 ducats. This figure did not include models or interior decorations. The cost of building St. Peter's has been translated into modern equivalents in wildly different ways. Some estimates put it at $33 billion. Others propose more conservative figures. What is beyond dispute is that the cost was staggering, that it strained even the resources of the wealthiest institution in Europe, and that indulgence revenue played a critical role in the early phases when Julius II and Leo X pushed the work forward. And it was Leo's aggressive campaign that brought the system into fatal conflict with a young theology professor in a small German town. Wittenberg Electoral Saxony, October 1517. Martin Luther is 33 years old, an Augustinian friar and professor of moral theology at the University of Wittenberg. He is not a radical. He is, as scholars later describe him, an angry Catholic. He loves the church. He believes in the sacraments, the papacy, and the authority of bishops, but he is troubled. For months, he has heard reports from parishioners who crossed the border to hear Johann Tetzel preach at Jüterboog, a town just outside Electoral Saxony. Elector Frederick the Wise banned indulgent sales in his territory. Frederick preferred that his subjects spend their money on his own relics collection, a stunning hoard of 19,000 relics with attached indulgences displayed at the castle church in Wittenberg. But Jüterboog was close, 24 miles away. Wittenbergers walked there, heard Tetzel's pitch, paid their coins, and returned with certificates. Some brought those certificates to Luther in the confessional, believing they were now covered, absolved not just of sin, but of any need for penance or amendment of life. Luther was alarmed. This was not how indulgences were supposed to work. Even granting the church's teaching, indulgences presupposed confession, contrition, and a genuine intention to turn from sin. Tetzel's preaching suggested you could buy your way out with no interior change required. Worse, Tetzel claimed the indulgence worked for the dead. Pay the fee, spring your mother from purgatory instantly. No prayer, no uncertainty, just a transaction. Luther studied the theology. He found it wanting. He believed the Pope's intentions were good, but that preachers like Tetzel were abusing the system and misleading the faithful. On October 31st, 1517, Luther wrote to Archbishop Albert of Brandenburg, enclosing a document titled Disputatio pro declaratione virtutis indulgentiarum, known in English as Disputation on the power and efficacy of indulgences. 95 propositions intended for academic debate. The theses were in Latin, the language of scholars, not a popular manifesto. Whether Luther also nailed them to the door of the castle church, the famous image, is now doubted by many historians. The church door served as a university bulletin board. Posting theses there for debate was routine. Dramatic, perhaps, but not unusual. What was unusual was the content and the timing. The theses struck directly at the funding of St. Peter's. Thesis 50. Christians are to be taught that if the Pope knew the exactions of the indulgence preachers, he would rather that the Basilica of St. Peter were burned to ashes than built up with the skin, flesh, and bones of his sheep. Thesis 51. Christians are to be taught that the Pope would and should wish to give of his own money, even though he had to sell the Basilica of St. Peter, to many of those from whom certain hawkers of indulgences cajole money. Thesis 86. Why does not the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest Crassus, build this one Basilica of St. Peter with his own money rather than with the money of poor believers? Thesis 27. Attack the coin in the coffer claim. There is no divine authority for preaching that the soul flies out of the purgatory immediately the money clinks in the bottom of the chest. The theses were not calls for revolution. Luther did not deny the usefulness of indulgences or question papal authority. He questioned the abuses. He questioned the commercialization. He questioned whether the Pope, if properly informed, would tolerate such preaching. Luther assumed, naively, that the Pope would intervene once the abuses were exposed. He was wrong. The theses spread with shocking speed. Within 2 weeks, they circulated throughout Germany, translated into German by others, and printed on the new technology of movable type. What Luther intended as an academic disputation became a public controversy. Johann Tetzel, stung by the attack, drafted counter-theses defending indulgence doctrine and his preaching. In January 1518, he presented them at Frankfurt. The battle was joined. Archbishop Albert, recognizing the danger, forwarded Luther's theses to Rome with a note suggesting heresy. Pope Leo then reportedly dismissed the matter lightly at first. Some accounts claim he called Luther a drunken German who would come to his senses when he sobered up. But Luther did not back down. In October 1518, Cardinal Cajetan examined him at Augsburg. The meeting was tense. Cajetan demanded that Luther recant. Luther refused unless shown scriptural or rational grounds for error. Cajetan, to his credit, condemned Tetzel's extreme claims. He stated that preachers making such promises must not be accepted as mouthpieces of the church, but he insisted that Luther submit to papal authority. Luther left Augsburg without recanting. In November 1518, Leo X issued the bull Cum Postquam, attempting to clarify official indulgence teaching and to distance the church from the worst abuses. It did not calm the controversy. Luther continued to write, preach, and debate. In July 1519, at the Leipzig Disputation, he argued with theologian Johann Eck and went further, questioning not just indulgences but the authority of councils and, by implication, the papacy itself. On June 15, 1520, Leo X issued the bull Exsurge Domine, condemning 41 of Luther's propositions and threatening excommunication. Luther responded by burning the bull publicly on December 10, 1520. On January 3, 1521, Leo X formally excommunicated Martin Luther. In April 1521, Luther appeared before the Diet of Worms, an assembly of the Holy Roman Empire. He was ordered to recant. He refused. According to tradition, he said the words, "Here I stand. I can do no other." Whether those exact words were spoken is uncertain, but the substance is not. Luther would not recant unless convinced by Scripture and reason. On May 25, 1521, the Edict of Worms declared Luther a heretic and an outlaw. Frederick the Wise, Luther's protector, staged a fake kidnapping and hid Luther at Wartburg Castle for safety. There, Luther translated the New Testament into German. The Reformation spread. Princes and city councils across Germany broke with Rome. Scandinavia followed. England, for different reasons, broke away under Henry VIII. Switzerland, the Netherlands, Scotland, and parts of France and Eastern Europe embraced Protestant teaching. The unity of Western Christianity fractured. Wars of religion would ravage Europe for over a century. While many factors drove the Reformation, theology, politics, nationalism, printing technology, and the corruption of the late medieval church all played a role. The spark was indulgences, and the fuel was resentment that German money was being extracted to build a palace in Rome. The speed of the collapse is worth noting. In 1517, Luther was a provincial professor protesting a local abuse. By 1521, entire territories were in revolt. By 1530, Protestant princes formed the Schmalkaldic League, a military alliance against the Catholic emperor. By 1555, the Peace of Augsburg granted legal recognition to Lutheranism in the Holy Roman Empire under the principle cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm his religion. Rulers chose the faith of their territories. Subjects conformed or left. The fracture was not just theological, it was economic. When a German principality turned Protestant, it seized church property. Monasteries, convents, and episcopal lands all became state assets. The wealth that had flowed to Rome for centuries stopped. Indulgence revenue vanished entirely in Protestant regions. Even in territories that remained Catholic, sales plummeted. The system had been exposed. People now understood what Luther had revealed. Indulgences were not biblical doctrine, but medieval innovation, profitable innovation. The Council of Trent's reforms came too late. By the time Trent outlawed monetary indulgences in the 1560s, half of Europe had already left. The Church preserved the theology while abandoning the abuses, but the damage was permanent. St. Peter's would be completed, but not with German money, not with the flood of coins that Leo X had expected when he authorized Tetzel. The building rose, the cost was paid, but the bill came due in ways no architect had drawn and no pope had budgeted. The price was Christendom itself. Johann Tetzel, the man whose preaching provoked Luther's protest, died on August 11, 1519, just 2 years after the controversy began. He died in Leipzig, broken and ill. Luther, hearing of Tetzel's suffering, wrote to comfort him, saying the issue had not begun on Tetzel's account. Luther said the child had quite a different father. Tetzel received an honorable burial before the high altar in Leipzig. His name lived on as shorthand for the abuses that fractured the church. St. Peter's continued to rise. The Reformation reduced revenue, but it did not stop construction. Other sources, taxes, donations, and direct papal funds carried the work. The Council of Trent, meeting intermittently from 1545 to 1563, attempted Catholic reform. Among its decrees, it outlawed the collection of money for indulgences. Pope Pius V in 1567 forbade attaching indulgences to any financial contribution. The abuses Martin Luther attacked were formally ended, but the damage was done. Europe was divided. The Protestant territories would never return. The Catholic Church, slowly over centuries, acknowledged the harm. In 1967, Pope Paul VI issued the Apostolic Constitution Indulgentiarum Doctrina. It reaffirmed the validity of indulgences within Catholic theology, but it included a striking admission. Paul VI wrote that, unfortunately, the practice of indulgences had at times been improperly used, either through untimely and superfluous indulgences by which the power of the keys was humiliated and penitential satisfaction weakened, or through the collection of illicit profits by which indulgences were blasphemously defamed. Blasphemously defamed. Strong language. An acknowledgement, indirect but real, that the Church's own practices had brought scandal and division. In 1999, the Catholic Church and the Lutheran World Federation signed the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification, stating a common understanding that justification comes by God's grace through faith in Christ. Notably, the declaration avoided any mention of indulgences. The wound was too deep, the history too painful. In 2016, on the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, Pope Francis attended a joint prayer service in Lund, Sweden, with Lutheran leaders. He said we must look with love and honesty at our past, recognizing error and seeking forgiveness. But theological disagreement remains. The Catholic Church still teaches and grants indulgences. Plenary indulgences were offered extensively during the 2025 Jubilee year. Lutherans and most Protestants reject the entire premise. They see no biblical basis for purgatory, no scriptural warrant for the treasury of merit, and no grounds for the Church claiming power to remit temporal punishment. The fracture that began in 1517 has not healed. Courtesy and dialogue have grown. Shared faith in Christ is affirmed. But the Reformation's questions remain unanswered in ways both sides accept. St. Peter's Basilica stands today as one of the world's architectural triumphs. It is breathtaking. The dome dominates Rome's skyline. The interior, covering 15,160 square meters, holds 60,000 people. Bernini's baldacchino rises 28.74 meters above the papal altar. Michelangelo's Pieta, carved when he was 24, rests in a side chapel. Art, history, and faith converge in a space designed to overwhelm. Approximately 10 million visitors pass through each year. Pilgrims pray at Peter's tomb. Tourists gaze upward at Michelangelo's dome. Popes celebrate Mass before global audiences. The basilica fulfills its purpose. It is magnificent. It is sacred space, and it was built, in significant part, through a mechanism that exploited fear, sold false certainty, and fractured Christianity. Who paid for St. Peter's? The masons from Italy who cut stone? The laborers who hauled limestone and oak? The German peasants who dropped coins into Tetzel's chest, believing they were saving their mothers from fire? The Catholic Church, which used its claimed spiritual authority to generate revenue? The Protestant nations that broke away rather than continue funding Rome's ambitions? The answer is all of them. Every grand vision has a price. Sometimes the price is measured in gold, sometimes in division, sometimes in centuries of religious war. Beauty and grandeur do not appear from nothing. Someone always pays. The arithmetic of St. Peter's tells its own story. 46 million ducats across 120 years. Break that down. The average annual cost was roughly 390,000 ducats. In years of intense construction under architects like Sangallo, costs spiked to 162,000 ducats in a single year. Where did it come from? Indulgences were only one stream. Papal taxes flowed from dioceses across Catholic Europe. Tithes were extracted from parishes. Fees for appointments to bishoprics financed the very corruption that put Albert of Brandenburg in debt to the Fuggers. Revenue came from the Papal States, the Church's own temporal territories in central Italy. Direct donations arrived from wealthy families seeking favor or salvation. Every source was tapped. But indulgences carried unique weight. They were voluntary in theory, coerced in practice. A tax can be resented but understood. A price for governance, for roads, for armies. An indulgence was different. It traded on fear and love. Fear of eternal suffering. Love for those already dead. Tetzel's pitch worked because it targeted the deepest human vulnerabilities. The mother who died before making a full confession, the father who lived roughly and might be suffering now, the child taken by fever. Pay and ease their pain. How do you refuse? The genius of the system was emotional extraction. It bypassed reason and went straight to the heart. And because the product was invisible and unmeasurable, there was no way to verify delivery. You paid, you received a certificate, you hoped. You believed because the alternative that you had been deceived by Holy Church was unthinkable. This was not simple corruption. It was structural exploitation built into theology and sold with liturgical authority. That is the darkness. Not that individuals stole, though some did, but that the system itself was designed to convert grief into gold, and the gold into stone. The question that haunted Biltmore, how long can this last? How do we sustain beauty when the cost is crushing, appeared at St. Peter's in a different key? Not the sustainability of a single estate, but the unity of a civilization. The Church believed it could fund its grandest project through indulgences without consequence. It was wrong. The consequence was fracture. The consequence was Luther. The consequence was the Reformation and everything that followed. Does that make St. Peter's Basilica less beautiful? No. Does it make the craftsmanship less worthy of admiration? No. Does it erase the theological and artistic achievement? No, but it means we cannot look at St. Peter's and see only glory. We have to see the shadow. We have to see Johann Tetzel standing in a marketplace promising release from purgatory for a price. We have to see Martin Luther alone in his study, reading scripture and realizing the church had wandered from its foundation. We have to see Europe fracturing, armies marching under religious banners, and centuries of suspicion and violence. The dark secret is this: St. Peter's Basilica, the world's largest church, symbol of Catholic faith and artistic genius, was funded in part by a system that reduced salvation to transaction, that exploited the grieving, and that so enraged a monk in Germany that he set in motion a division that has not healed in 500 years. The Reformation was not inevitable. It was not solely about indulgences, but indulgences were the spark, and the fuel was money flowing south to build a monument. We stand now in the 21st century. St. Peter's endures. It is cherished, protected, visited by millions. The Sistine Chapel next door, painted by Michelangelo between bouts of work on St. Peter's Dome, holds some of humanity's greatest art. The Vatican museums preserve culture. The Catholic Church, despite centuries of scandal and reform, remains a spiritual home to over 1 billion people. And Protestant churches, born in the fires of the Reformation, have shaped the modern world in ways neither Luther nor Leo VI could have imagined. The fracture produced diversity, debate, and in time, some measure of religious freedom. But the cost was real. The cost is still felt. Every Christian community divided by history carries this legacy. Every theological argument about grace, faith, works, and authority echoes Luther's protest. Every suspicion between Catholic and Protestant traces back to the moment when the Church chose to build in stone and paid for it by selling what should never have been sold. If you enjoy these investigations into architecture, power, and the hidden costs of grandeur, please like this video and subscribe. Tell me in the comments what other controversial histories you want explored. Hagia Sophia and the fall of Constantinople, the temples of Angkor Wat and the Khmer Empire, the palaces of Versailles and the French Revolution. Every monument has a story. Every story has a shadow. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next investigation. On the edge of Houston, Texas, stands a building that looks like an arena, feels like a stadium, and operates like a corporation. This is Lakewood Church. 16,000 seats, 45,000 weekly attendees, a sanctuary that was once the home of the Houston Rockets. At the center of it all is a man with a smile that never falters and a message that promises prosperity to anyone who believes hard enough. Joel Osteen. His sermons reach 100 countries. His books have sold tens of millions of copies. His personal net worth reportedly exceeds $100 million. He lives in a $10 million mansion while telling his congregation that God wants them to be rich. But this story is not just about one pastor or one church. It is about what happens when faith becomes a business, when salvation gets a price tag, and when the invisible hands that built the dream are erased from the story entirely. Behind the cameras and the stadium lights, behind the motivational speeches and the best-selling books, there is another Lakewood, a place where money flows in rivers while questions pile up like unanswered prayers, where Hurricane Harvey revealed cracks in the compassion narrative, where a plumber found $600,000 in cash hidden in a bathroom wall, where the tax-exempt status of a $100 million annual operation raises questions that no amount of positive thinking can answer. How did a church become this big? Who actually pays for it? And what happens when the prosperity gospel collides with the reality that most believers will never be prosperous? If you enjoy deep investigations into American institutions and the people who built them, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what topic I should explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. Joel Osteen did not set out to build an empire. He set out to avoid the spotlight entirely. Born in 1963, Joel was the son of John Osteen, a Southern Baptist pastor who founded Lakewood Church in 1959 in an abandoned feed store in Northeast Houston. By the 1990s, Lakewood had about 6,000 members, respectable, growing, but nowhere near what it would become. Joel showed no interest in following his father into ministry. He was shy, uncomfortable speaking in public, and more interested in television production than theology. He dropped out of Oral Roberts University after 1 year and returned to Houston to work behind the cameras at Lakewood. For 17 years, Joel operated the television equipment, edited footage, and managed the technical side of broadcasting his father's sermons. He was content to remain invisible. Then in January 1999, John Austin died suddenly of a heart attack. The church he had built for 40 years faced an immediate succession crisis. Joel was 36 years old. He had never preached a sermon. He had no theological training beyond what he absorbed growing up in the church, but he had something more valuable than credentials. He had the family name, the technical skills to maximize television reach, and a message that would prove far more marketable than his father's traditional Pentecostalism. Joel's first sermon was hesitant, his delivery uncertain. But within weeks, something became clear. Joel was not his father. John Austin preached hellfire and repentance. Joel preached positive thinking and God's favor. John emphasized sin and salvation. Joel emphasized success and self-improvement. Joel's theology was rooted in the prosperity gospel, the belief that faith produces financial blessing, that God wants believers to be wealthy, and that poverty is a sign of insufficient belief. The shift was not accidental. Joel understood instinctively what his father had only partially grasped. Americans, particularly middle-class Americans, anxious about economic security, did not want to hear about their sins. They wanted to hear that they deserved better, that their struggles were temporary, that breakthrough was coming. The message was simple, repetitive, and emotionally satisfying. It required no theological depth, no biblical literacy, no uncomfortable self-examination. Just believe. Just think positively. Just expect good things, and good things will come. The formula worked immediately. Attendance surged. Within 2 years of taking over, Joel had doubled the congregation. By 2003, Lakewood was bursting out of its Northeast Houston facility. They needed more space, much more. Joel set his sights on something audacious: the Compact Center. The Compact Center sat empty in Southwest Houston, a massive arena that had been home to the Houston Rockets until 2003. The building had 16,000 seats, multiple levels, vast concourses, and all the infrastructure of a major sports and entertainment venue. Joel Austin saw an opportunity that no other pastor in America had the ambition or resources to pursue. He would turn a professional sports arena into a church. The idea was unprecedented at that scale. Other megachurches had built large sanctuaries, some seating 5,000 or even 10,000, but no church had taken over an existing major league arena and converted it wholesale. In 2003, Lakewood Church signed a long-term lease with the city of Houston. The church agreed to pay $11.8 million up front and approximately $1 million annually in rent. The real cost came in renovation. Every seat needed to be replaced. The court needed to be covered with a permanent stage. Lighting and sound systems had to be upgraded to broadcast quality. Backstage areas had to be converted to offices, green rooms, and production facilities. The project consumed more than $100 million. Where did the money come from? The official answer is donations. Lakewood launched a capital campaign asking members to contribute beyond their regular tithes to fund the renovation. The church reported that the project was paid for entirely through congregant giving, with no debt incurred. The numbers are staggering if accurate. To raise $100 million from donations meant that Lakewood's members, who were already tithing 10% of their income, gave additional massive sums over a short period. The alternative explanation, never confirmed but widely suspected, is that a small number of very wealthy members provided the bulk of the funding. These donors remain anonymous. Their motivations are private, but their influence over the church's direction is real. By July 2005, the renovation was complete. The building had been transformed. Plush seating replaced bleachers. Enormous video screens flanked the stage. Professional lighting created an atmosphere more concert than worship. The sanctuary held 16,000 people. Services were held multiple times each weekend to accommodate demand. At capacity, Lakewood could host 50,000 people across all weekend services, making it by far the largest church in America by attendance. The move to the arena marked a turning point. Lakewood was no longer just a church. It was a brand, an experience, a destination. But the arena was only the visible part. Behind the stage, another Lakewood operated, the one that made the spectacle possible. The production operation at Lakewood Church rivals any television studio. Multiple camera crews film every service. Directors in control rooms cut between angles in real time. The church's television program airs in over 100 countries and reaches an estimated 10 million viewers weekly. This is not a side project. This is the core business model. Television extends Lakewood's reach exponentially. It generates book sales, conference attendance, and donations from viewers who never set foot in Houston. It builds Joel's celebrity, which in turn drives the church's growth. The operation requires staff, lots of staff. Lakewood employs several hundred people. Volunteer labor is essential. Ushers, greeters, childcare workers, parking attendants, and musicians all work for free, covering roles that would otherwise require paid employees. If every volunteer position had to be compensated, the cost of operating the church would multiply several times over. The financial structure is opaque. As a religious organization, Lakewood Church is not required to disclose its finances publicly. The church reports that its annual revenue exceeds $100 million, generated almost entirely from tithes and offerings. The church insists that Joel Osteen takes no salary from Lakewood. This claim is technically accurate, but misleading. Joel's income comes from book sales and speaking fees, not from the church payroll. But the church provides the platform that makes those income streams possible. His books sell because he has a massive audience built through Lakewood's resources. His speaking fees command hundreds of thousands of dollars because he leads America's largest church. The separation is legal, but artificial. Lakewood made Joel wealthy, just indirectly. Joel's net worth is estimated between $50 million and $100 million. He lives in a $10.5 million mansion in River Oaks, Houston's most exclusive neighborhood. The 17,000 square foot house features 6 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, and 3 elevators. Joel drives luxury vehicles and travels by private jet when his schedule demands it. The prosperity gospel insists this is not hypocrisy, but proof of concept. Joel teaches that God rewards faith with material blessing. His wealth is presented as evidence that his message is true. Followers are encouraged to see Joel's success as a preview of their own potential prosperity. But statistically, that prosperity will never arrive for most of them. Studies of megachurch attendees show that the majority are middle to lower middle class. They tithe faithfully, often contributing significant portions of their modest incomes. The church grows wealthier, the pastor grows wealthier, the congregants, on average, do not. This is the central economic reality of the prosperity gospel. The message generates wealth for those who sell it. For those who buy it, the primary return is emotional, not financial. The theology that built Lakewood did not originate with Joel Osteen. The prosperity gospel emerged in the mid-20th century from Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity. Early proponents like Oral Roberts and Kenneth Hagin taught that faith was a force that could be directed toward material outcomes. The movement gained traction during the 1970s and the 1980s as televangelists like Jim Bakker and Benny Hinn built media empires preaching prosperity theology. Scandals eventually brought down many of these figures. Jim Bakker went to prison for fraud, but the theology survived because it offered something irresistible, a vision of Christianity that required no sacrifice, no suffering, no uncomfortable confrontation with sin or injustice. Joel Osteen represents the polished evolution of this tradition. He avoids the theatrical emotionalism of earlier televangelists. His delivery is calm, his smile constant, his message relentlessly upbeat. He has repackaged the prosperity gospel as self-help spirituality. His sermons rarely mention sin, repentance, or hell. Instead, he offers affirmations. You are blessed, you are favored, your best days are ahead. Promotion is coming, the breakthrough is near. It is a message designed to make people feel good, not to challenge them. But theologically, it represents a profound departure from historic Christian teaching. Traditional Christianity teaches that suffering is often part of the Christian life, that wealth is spiritually dangerous, that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. Jesus himself lived in poverty and told his followers to sell their possessions and give to the poor. The prosperity gospel inverts all of this. It treats wealth as a sign of God's favor rather than a spiritual hazard. It transforms Christianity from a religion of sacrifice into a religion of accumulation. Critics within Christianity have condemned prosperity teaching as heresy. They argue it distorts the gospel and exploits the vulnerable. But these critiques have little impact on Lakewood's growth. The people filling the seats are interested in hope. And Joel offers hope in unlimited supply. The cracks in the prosperity narrative appeared on August 27, 2017. Hurricane Harvey made landfall on the Texas coast as a Category 4 storm. Over the following days, it stalled over Houston, dumping more than 40 inches of rain. More than 30,000 people were displaced. Emergency shelters opened across the city. Lakewood Church, with its 16,000-seat arena and vast facilities, did not open its doors. As floodwaters rose and families sought refuge, Lakewood remained closed. Joel Osteen posted on social media that the church was inaccessible due to flooding, but photographs quickly circulated showing that the church was largely dry and accessible. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Social media exploded with accusations that Joel cared more about protecting church property than helping flood victims. Other churches, mosques, and private citizens had opened their doors immediately. Lakewood, the richest and largest congregation in the city, had waited. The contrast was stark and impossible to ignore. For years, Joel had preached that faith unlocks God's provision, that believers should expect supernatural intervention in times of need, that the church exists to demonstrate God's love in tangible ways. Yet when Houston's moment of greatest need arrived, when thousands of families lost everything to the floodwaters, when the city desperately needed every available shelter, the church, whose weekly message promised divine favor and miraculous provision, initially chose self-preservation over service. The irony was not lost on observers. A church built on the promise that God takes care of those who give generously had apparently forgotten that generosity flows both ways. Social media users pointed out the obvious. If prosperity theology actually worked, should not the prosperous be the first to help? Under mounting pressure, Lakewood finally opened as a shelter several days after the storm. The church ultimately contributed millions of dollars to Harvey relief. But the damage to Joel's reputation was done. The hurricane had revealed something uncomfortable. When crisis struck, the church that preached relentless positivity had hesitated. The institution that collected $100 million annually had been slow to act when the faithful needed help. If the church is sitting on enormous financial reserves, why had those reserves not been immediately deployed in the city's worst natural disaster? Lakewood never provided detailed financial disclosures. Then, in November 2021, another revelation cracked the facade. A plumber working on a toilet repair at Lakewood discovered something extraordinary. Envelopes stuffed with cash and checks were hidden inside a wall in a church bathroom. The discovery revealed the stash contained approximately $600,000. The discovery immediately connected to an unsolved mystery from 2014. In March of 2014, Lakewood had reported a theft. Someone had stolen $600,000 in cash and checks from a safe in the church, a single weekend's offerings. The theft was never solved until a plumber found it 7 years later inside a bathroom wall. If the money was stolen, why was it hidden in a church bathroom rather than taken off the premises? Who put it there? Lakewood's official response was brief. They thanked the plumber and confirmed the money was connected to the 2014 incident. They offered no further explanation. The case remains unresolved. The incident added to a growing perception. Lakewood handles enormous sums of cash in ways that are not fully transparent, and when irregularities occur, explanations are limited. Tithing is central to how money flows into Lakewood. The money coming in every week comes primarily from tithes, the biblical practice of giving 10% of one's income to the church. Tithing is presented not as optional, but as obedience to God. The implication is clear. Tithe and God will bless you financially. Fail to tithe and you are robbing God, inviting financial struggle. This creates psychological pressure. Members believe that not tithing will result in divine displeasure and material hardship. Even families struggling to pay bills are encouraged to tithe first, trusting that God will provide the rest. For a church the size of Lakewood, the math is staggering. If 40,000 regular attendees tithe on median household incomes, the annual total easily exceeds $100 million. Where it goes is not disclosed. Compare this to secular nonprofits of similar size. Organizations with $100 million budgets file detailed Form 990 tax returns showing executive compensation, program expenses, and financial reserves. Churches are exempt. Lakewood files a basic return acknowledging tax-exempt status, but providing no financial detail. This exemption is rooted in the First Amendment. The trade-off is that churches escape the transparency required of other tax-exempt organizations. The result is a system vulnerable to abuse. Megachurches are particularly concerning because the sums involved are so large. Joel Osteen's personal wealth highlights the core tension. He insists he takes no salary from Lakewood, but his income is entirely dependent on the platform Lakewood provides. Without Lakewood, Joel Osteen is nobody. The church made him. The tax structure allows Joel to benefit personally while the church remains exempt. Book royalties are taxable personal income. But the church pays no taxes on the revenue that funds the infrastructure making those royalties possible. Joel receives the profit. The church avoids the tax. The system is legal, but it raises questions about fairness. The prosperity gospel adds another layer. When a church teaches that financial giving produces financial return, it creates a transactional relationship. Congregants give expecting to receive. When the return does not materialize, they are told their faith is insufficient. The church benefits regardless. If giving produces blessing, the church is facilitating divine reward. If giving does not produce blessing, the failure is the giver's. The church cannot lose. The people who fill Lakewood's 16,000 seats every weekend are searching for something: community, meaning, hope. Lakewood provides that. The services are professionally produced and emotionally uplifting. People make friends. They find support. For many attendees, these benefits are real and valuable. The emotional appeal is powerful. Joel's sermons are designed to make people feel good about themselves. For someone struggling with unemployment, health issues, or relationship problems, this message offers relief. It suggests that breakthrough is coming. It provides hope when hope is scarce. The cost is that this hope is often false. The prosperity gospel promises financial breakthrough to all believers. Statistically, that cannot be true. Economic mobility is limited. Systemic barriers based on race, class, education, and geography constrain opportunity. Hard work and positive thinking do not guarantee success in an economy where wages stagnate and medical debt destroys savings. Joel's message ignores these realities. He preaches as though the only barrier to prosperity is insufficient faith. This places the burden of failure on individuals. It says you are not prospering because you are not believing hard enough, not tithing faithfully. This theology produces shame. People who are struggling financially often feel like spiritual failures. The message is psychologically damaging and factually wrong. The church also produces financial strain directly. Families who tithe 10% of their income while living paycheck to paycheck are making a significant sacrifice. For a household earning $50,000 annually, tithing costs $5,000. That is money that could pay down debt or cover emergencies. When church leaders teach that failing to tithe invites divine curse, they create pressure that borders on coercion. Some members give beyond their means, contributing to capital campaigns on top of regular tithes. They go into debt believing that God will repay them. Most of the time, God does not. The debt remains, the church keeps the money. Lakewood defends this by pointing to its outreach programs. The church provides food distribution, job training, and addiction recovery support. These programs help people, but they are a fraction of the church's budget. Observers estimate that megachurches typically spend 10% to 25% of revenue on direct charitable work. The rest goes to salaries, facilities, and media production. Compare that to effective secular charities, which often direct 75% or more of revenue to program services. Lakewood operates at corporate overhead levels while claiming the moral authority and tax benefits of a charity. Joel Osteen's media presence extends far beyond Lakewood's walls. His books have sold more than 20 million copies worldwide. Your Best Life Now, published in 2004, spent more than 200 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. The books are formulaic, repackaging the same core message in slightly different language. But the books sell because they make people feel good. Joel's name recognition drives sales. The Lakewood platform generates that recognition. Every Sunday, millions of people watch Joel preach. When his book appears in a store, they buy it. The publishing deals are lucrative. With 20 million copies sold over 2 decades, the cumulative income reaches tens of millions. Joel retains the money. Lakewood provides the platform, but the books would not sell without Lakewood's audience. The church's resources create the celebrity that makes the books profitable. Joel's speaking fees tell the same story. Joel commands hundreds of thousands of dollars for each appearance. The fees are paid to Joel personally, not to Lakewood. But the demand for Joel exists only because he leads Lakewood. Lakewood made Joel Osteen. Joel Osteen made Joel Osteen rich. The separation is legal and technically defensible, but it feels like a shell game. The institution that benefits from tax exemption creates the celebrity that generates taxable income. The celebrity keeps the money. The institution avoids financial disclosure. The broader prosperity gospel industry extends far beyond Lakewood. Kenneth Copeland, Creflo Dollar, Joyce Meyer, and T.D. Jakes operate similarly scaled operations. Each has their own megachurch, television program, and book deals. Each lives in extraordinary wealth. Copeland owns multiple private jets. Dollar tried to raise $65 million from followers to buy a private jet, arguing that commercial airlines were filled with demons. These preachers defend their wealth using the same logic Joel employs. Their prosperity proves their faith, but the pattern is consistent. The preachers get rich. The congregants do not. In 2007, Senator Chuck Grassley launched an inquiry into 6 prominent ministries. The investigation sought financial records to determine whether these organizations were abusing tax-exempt status. Most ministries resisted, claiming religious persecution. The investigation ended without significant legal action, but the inquiry confirmed what critics had long argued. Prosperity ministries operate with minimal oversight, handle enormous sums of money, and enrich their leaders at levels that would be scandalous in secular nonprofits. Lakewood fits the same pattern: large revenue, opaque finances, a wealthy leader, and tax exemption. The difference is that Joel has cultivated a more mainstream image. He avoids theatrical excesses. His approach is softer, more media savvy, and designed to avoid controversy. But the substance is the same. Teach that faith produces wealth. Collect donations from people who believe that teaching. Live in extraordinary luxury while most followers remain financially strained. The theological critique goes deeper than finances. Prosperity gospel teaching fundamentally distorts Christianity. Historic Christian teaching emphasizes that suffering is often part of the faithful life. Jesus promised his followers persecution, not prosperity. He told them to take up their crosses. The apostles were imprisoned, beaten, and executed. For centuries, Christians understood that following Christ might cost them everything. The prosperity gospel erases this. It turns Christianity into a self-improvement program where God exists to make believers successful. Prayer becomes a tool for getting what you want. Faith becomes a transaction. This theology has no room for the cross, no space for sacrifice. When prosperity does not arrive, the theology blames the believer. You did not have enough faith. This produces guilt and shame rather than addressing real structural barriers to economic mobility. The social implications are significant. Prosperity theology teaches people to focus on personal advancement rather than collective justice. It discourages questioning systemic inequality because the system is not the problem. Individual faith is the problem. This is demonstrably false and politically convenient. It directs attention away from minimum wage debates, healthcare access, racial discrimination, and other actual barriers that limit opportunity. Megachurches like Lakewood rarely engage in social justice work. They do not advocate for living wages or challenge the systems that keep people poor. They preach individual prosperity while ignoring collective oppression. This aligns the church with the interests of wealth and power. Prosperity theology tells poor people that their poverty is their fault. It tells rich people that their wealth is God's blessing. It sanctifies inequality. It baptizes capitalism. Joel Osteen will never preach a sermon challenging corporate greed or tax structures that favor the wealthy. His entire operation depends on not asking those questions. What happens next is uncertain. Joel Osteen is 61 years old. The succession question looms. Joel has children, but none have shown interest in pastoral ministry. When Joel eventually steps aside, Lakewood will face the same challenge it faced when his father died. Can the institution survive without the founding personality? Megachurches often collapse when their celebrity pastors leave. The congregation is loyal to the person, not the institution. Without Joel, would 40,000 people keep attending? The answer is probably no. Lakewood is Joel. Joel is Lakewood. When he is gone, the church will either find another charismatic figure to sustain the model, or it will contract significantly. Other megachurches offer cautionary examples. Crystal Cathedral declared bankruptcy in 2010 after its founder retired and succession failed. Mars Hill Church collapsed in 2014 after founding pastor Mark Driscoll resigned amid allegations of misconduct. These examples demonstrate that megachurches are fragile despite their size. They depend on personalities, not institutions. Lakewood appears stable, but that stability rests entirely on Joel. His scandal-free image is essential. If serious allegations emerged, the church would face crisis. So far, Joel has avoided the scandals that destroyed other prosperity preachers. His carefully managed public image has protected him, but that image is also a vulnerability. The cash in the wall incident raised questions. Another incident could prove more costly. The broader prosperity gospel movement faces increasing criticism from within Christianity. Evangelical leaders have become more vocal in condemning prosperity teaching as heresy. Influential pastors have publicly criticized the movement. The cultural tide may be turning. Younger evangelicals are less attracted to prosperity theology. They are more skeptical of wealthy celebrity preachers. They prioritize social justice and authenticity over motivational positivity. This generational shift could undermine Lakewood's long-term growth. If the church cannot attract younger members, attendance will decline as the current congregation ages. The legal landscape could also shift. Growing awareness of megachurch financial practices has prompted calls for reform. Some advocates push for requiring churches to file the same detailed financial disclosures as other nonprofits. These reforms face strong political opposition. Religious freedom protections make it difficult to regulate churches, but public pressure could eventually force change. Lakewood operates within the current legal framework, but that framework is not permanent. The human cost of the prosperity gospel is hardest to measure and most important to understand. Behind the stadium lights and best-selling books are real people making real sacrifices. Single mothers tithing 10% of minimum wage paychecks, believing that God will multiply it back. Families going into debt to attend church conferences, elderly believers giving retirement savings to the church, trusting that divine provision will follow. For some, the church provides genuine community that justifies the cost. For others, the cost is devastating. Financial strain, psychological guilt, shame when prosperity does not arrive, the realization that the promise was always unrealistic. These stories rarely make headlines. The people living them often do not speak publicly. They blame themselves for failing to believe hard enough. Some eventually leave, disillusioned and financially damaged. Others stay, hoping that this year will be different. The church counts on this. It counts on people staying, keeping giving, keeping believing. The revenue depends on it. Joel Osteen's wealth depends on it. Lakewood's survival depends on it. The question is what responsibility the church bears for the gap between promise and reality. If the prosperity gospel teaches that faith produces financial blessing and that blessing does not materialize for most believers, has the church lied? The church would say no. God's timing is not our timing. Blessings come in many forms. These responses shift the burden back to believers. The problem is never the theology. It is always the believer's application of it. This is intellectually dishonest and morally troubling. If a teaching consistently fails to produce the promised results, the teaching is flawed. If people give financially, expecting divine multiplication, and that multiplication does not occur, the transaction has failed. The church collected the money. The believers received nothing material in return. In any other context, this would be called fraud. In religious context, it is called faith. Standing outside Lakewood Church on a Sunday morning, the scale is overwhelming. Cars fill parking lots stretching across dozens of acres. Families stream toward the entrance, dressed in their Sunday best. Inside, the sanctuary fills with 16,000 people. The screens light up, the band plays. Joel takes the stage, smiling that constant smile, and begins his message. For 30 minutes, he will tell them they are blessed, favored, destined for greatness. The audience will believe, at least for those 30 minutes, that everything will be okay. That breakthrough is near. Then, the service will end. They will return home and face the same bills, the same jobs, the same limitations they faced before. Most will return next Sunday. They will tithe again. They will believe again. They will hope again, because hope is what Lakewood sells. And hope, even false hope, is worth something when life feels hard. The tragedy is not that people believe. The tragedy is that the belief enriches those who sell it while leaving the believers largely unchanged. The system works brilliantly for Joel Osteen. It works profitably for Lakewood Church. Whether it works for anyone else is a question the church will never answer honestly, because answering honestly would require transparency the institution has carefully avoided. It would require acknowledging that the prosperity gospel is primarily a revenue model, not a theological truth. It would require admitting that the wealth flows upward from the many to the few, from the congregation to the celebrity. The dark story of Lakewood Church is not that it exists. The dark story is what it promises and who pays the price for those promises, the invisible hands that fill the offering buckets every week, the volunteers who donate thousands of hours, the families who sacrifice financially, believing that God will reward them. They built this, they sustain this, they pay for this, and most of them will never see the prosperity they were promised. The mansion in River Oaks stands as proof, not of God's favor, but of a system that extracts wealth from the hopeful and concentrates it in the hands of those who know how to monetize faith. The stadium still glows on Sunday mornings. The cameras still roll, the books still sell, the promise still echoes. Your best life is coming. Breakthrough is near. God wants you blessed. The people keep believing. The money keeps flowing. And the dark truth remains. For most of them, the best life will never arrive. But they will keep tithing, keep hoping, keep waiting. Because hope, even when it is sold rather than earned, is the last thing people surrender. And Lakewood Church knows that better than anyone. Jerusalem, approximately 959 BCE. Morning light strikes limestone. On Mount Moriah, above the ancient city, stands a structure that does not feel like a building. It feels like a statement carved in stone and overlaid in gold. 60 cubits long, 30 high, 20 wide. Every surface inside glows with beaten gold. The walls, the floors, the doors, the ceiling, even the nails are gold. Beautiful. Yes, but that is just what visitors see. Behind the gleaming facade are 183,000 hands, forced hands, stonecutters working mountains in Lebanon, burden carriers bent under loads they did not choose, Israelites conscripted in monthly rotations, 1 month breaking their backs, 2 months home. And deeper, the permanent slaves, 150,000 Canaanites placed in bondage that will never end, building a house for a God who commanded freedom. The bills are staggering. 100,000 talents of gold, if you believe the numbers, 3,400 metric tons. That is more gold than some nations will mine in a century. Then the cost nobody records, the deaths, the injuries, the families torn apart by labor camps. And there is more. This temple will fall twice, once to Babylon in fire and slaughter, once to Rome with 1 million dead. Between those destructions, 70 years of weeping exile and centuries of longing. Can gold make you eternal if blood paid for it? And the real question, who actually paid for Solomon's temple? And how much does this dream cost today in dollars we understand, in consequences we can measure? If you enjoy deep investigations into biblical history, ancient architecture, and the true cost of religious monuments, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what biblical structure we should examine next. Mount Moriah, the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. This is where it starts, where David, Solomon's father, bought land after a plague killed 70,000 Israelites. The price was 50 shekels of silver for the threshing floor and 600 shekels for the surrounding area. A purchase made in blood and desperation, land sanctified by catastrophe. David planned a temple and he gathered materials, but God forbade him because there was too much blood on his hands from war. The work fell to his son. Solomon inherited a kingdom at peace, its borders secured by his father's campaigns. He also inherited wealth beyond counting and a clear charge: build a house for the Lord, a permanent dwelling to replace the portable tabernacle that had followed Israel through the wilderness and conquest for centuries. Solomon was young when he took the throne. The Bible says God offered him anything. He asked for wisdom. God granted it, plus riches and honor unmatched among kings. Whether that is history or legend, the result is documented. Solomon became the wealthiest monarch of his age, and he poured that wealth into stone and cedar and gold. The planning begins in Solomon's fourth year as king, approximately 966 BCE. The vision is clear: a temple that will awe nations, prove Israel's God is supreme, and establish Jerusalem as the center of worship forever. The design follows patterns given to Moses for the tabernacle, but scaled to permanence. A rectangular structure aligned east to west, an outer courtyard for the people, an inner courtyard for priests. The temple building itself includes a porch, a main hall called the Holy Place, and at the far end, a perfect cube 20 cubits on each side, the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant will rest in total darkness except for the presence of God. But materials and craftsmen are not enough. Solomon needs things Israel does not have: cedar from Lebanon, timber that does not rot, prized for centuries, skilled craftsmen in bronze and gold, artisans Israel's agricultural society cannot produce in sufficient numbers. He needs stone, massive quantities cut to precision. He needs time, labor, and control. Solomon makes a deal with Hiram, king of Tyre. Hiram sends cedar and cypress logs, floated down the coast from Lebanon to Joppa, then hauled overland to Jerusalem. He sends a master craftsman also named Hiram, sometimes called Huram-Abi, a man whose mother is Israelite and whose father is Tyrian, skilled in bronze work beyond anything Solomon's people can match. In exchange, Solomon sends Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat annually, 20,000 baths of olive oil, and later 120 talents of gold. The partnership is essential. But materials and craftsmen are still not enough. Solomon needs bodies, thousands of them. 1 Kings chapter 5 is precise: 30,000 Israelites conscripted for forced labor. They work in shifts, 10,000 at a time. 1 month in Lebanon cutting and hauling timber, 2 months at home. It is rotating bondage, temporary slavery with a rhythm that lets men see their families, but never lets them refuse. The overseer is Adoniram, a name that will be remembered for the wrong reasons. Then come the permanent workers: 80,000 stonecutters, 70,000 burden carriers. These are not Israelites. These are conquered peoples: Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. The Bible calls them Mas Obed, permanent slave labor. Verse 9:22 of 1 Kings tries to soften it and says, no Israelite was made a slave, only soldiers and officials. But verse 9:21 is clear. The Canaanites who remained in the land were pressed into permanent forced labor. 150,000 people whose lives became stone dust, crushed spines, and early deaths, building a monument to a God most of them did not worship. Add it up: 30,000 Israelites in rotation, 80,000 stonecutters, 70,000 carriers, 3,300 overseers, or 3,850 depending on which verse you read. The total workforce exceeds 183,000. That is larger than most ancient cities, larger than the population of Jerusalem itself at the time. For 7 years, Mount Moriah is a construction site unlike anything the ancient Near East has seen outside Egypt's pyramids. Men quarry limestone in the mountains and shape it to specification. The blocks are massive, some weighing tons. They are cut so precisely that 1 Kings says no hammer or axe or iron tool was heard at the building site. The stones arrive ready, fitted so tightly that mortar barely matters. The human cost is not counted. The Bible records no tally of how many men died in quarries, backs broken by stones they could not hold, how many were crushed by falling blocks, bodies pulverized between limestone and earth, how many collapsed from exhaustion, hearts giving out under summer sun, or fell ill in crowded labor camps where sanitation was an afterthought and medical care non-existent. How many families received news that a father, a son, a brother would not return from the king's mountain? The text gives dimensions and materials and timelines, measurements of glory. But the dead remain unnamed and unnumbered, their bones scattered in anonymous graves or left where they fell. What we know is what happened after. When Solomon dies and his son Rehoboam takes the throne, the northern tribes come with a request: ease the forced labor. Your father's yoke was heavy. Lighten it. Rehoboam consults elders who served Solomon. They advise gentleness. Then he consults young men who grew up with him. They advise harshness. Rehoboam chooses harshness. My father beat you with whips, he tells the tribes. I'll beat you with scorpions. The kingdom splits that day. 10 tribes in the north form Israel. 2 tribes in the south remain Judah. Adonram, the overseer of forced labor, is sent to collect workers from the northern tribes. They stone him to death. The forced labor system that built the temple destroys the united kingdom. The cost is not just sweat and broken bodies, it is political fracture that will never heal. But the temple stands, and it is magnificent. The main structure is 60 cubits long, that is 90 feet, 20 cubits wide, that is 30 feet, and 30 cubits high, that is 45 feet. Not vast by our standards, smaller than many modern churches, but every surface sings with craft and wealth. The exterior is limestone dressed smooth. Inside, cedar paneling covers every wall from floor to ceiling, carved with gourds and flowers and cherubim. Then gold. Sheets of pure gold hammered thin, nailed over the cedar. The floor is gold, the doors are gold, the altar is gold. The book of 1 Kings says the whole house was overlaid with gold until all of it was finished. The Holy of Holies, the inner cube, receives special attention. 20 cubits on each side, pure gold covers every surface, walls, floor, ceiling, making a shimmering cube where light does not reach. Inside, 2 olive wood cherubim, each 10 cubits high, that is 15 feet, their wings spanning the room, overlaid with gold. The result is a sealed, otherworldly space of glowing gold. The furnishings are bronze and gold. Hiram the craftsman casts 2 bronze pillars for the porch, each 18 cubits high, that is 27 feet, topped with ornate capitals. The pillars are named Jachin and Boaz. Their purpose is debated, structural, symbolic, or both. They frame the entrance, massive and gleaming. Then, the molten sea, a bronze basin cast as a single piece, 10 cubits across, that is 15 feet in diameter and 5 cubits deep. It holds 12,000 gallons of water for priestly washing. The basin rests on 12 bronze oxen arranged in groups of 3, facing the 4 directions. The casting alone is a technical marvel. Bronze in that quantity requires enormous furnaces, precise alloy mixtures, and the skill to pour without cracking. Hiram delivers. He also makes 10 bronze stands on wheels, each holding a smaller basin. He makes pots and shovels and sprinkling bowls and all the temple's bronze implements. The bronze work alone represents a metallurgical achievement that will be studied and copied for centuries. Then there is the gold. 1 Chronicles chapter 22 says David prepared 100,000 talents of gold for the temple, 1,000,000 talents of silver, bronze and iron beyond measure. A talent weighs approximately 75 pounds or 34 kilograms. 100,000 talents of gold equals 3,400 metric tons. Let that settle. Total gold ever mined in human history is roughly 200,000 metric tons. The Bible is claiming David set aside 1.7% of all the gold humanity will ever extract. At $2,700 per troy ounce, at 2025 prices, that is over $140 billion. Some scholars push that past $300 billion. Even the lower estimate in 1 Kings, which lists 8,000 talents used in the temple construction, still gives you over $24 billion in gold alone. Then add silver, bronze, iron, timber, and labor, and the cost breaks the imagination. Modern scholars call these numbers symbolic. They say the figures are exaggerated to stress the temple's importance, not to be taken as a literal inventory. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' Bible Notes say as much. Conservative estimates bring the cost down to $3 to $6 billion in modern terms. That is still more than most nations spend on a single building. It is in the range of Dubai's most extravagant projects, major airports, and Olympic stadiums. If the biblical numbers are even partly literal, Solomon built the most expensive structure in ancient history, maybe in all history until the modern era. For comparison, Herod's later expansion of the Second Temple employed 10,000 workers and took over 80 years. The Great Mosque of Mecca, with ongoing expansions, has crossed $100 billion. Solomon does it in 7 years with forced labor, and the result is something that makes neighboring kings send delegations just to see if the reports are true. The dedication happens in Solomon's 11th year. The temple is complete. Furnishings are in place. The Ark of the Covenant is carried in procession by priests. It enters the Holy of Holies and is set beneath the cherubim's wings. 2 Chronicles says, when the priests withdrew, cloud filled the temple, glory so thick the priests couldn't perform their service. Fire comes down from heaven and consumes the burnt offerings. Solomon prays. His prayer is recorded. Will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built? It's a question that cuts. If God is infinite, why does he need gold? Why the forced labor, the extravagance, the wealth that could feed thousands? The text doesn't answer. It records the glory and the cost and leaves the tension unresolved. The temple stands for 370 years, give or take. It becomes the center of Jewish worship, the place where sacrifices are offered daily, where festivals bring pilgrims from across the kingdom, where priests maintain rituals prescribed in Leviticus, and where the presence of God is believed to dwell in thick darkness behind the veil. But kingdoms do not last. Israel and Judah, split since Rehoboam's foolishness, struggle separately. Israel falls first to Assyria in 722 BCE. Judah survives longer, but barely. The Babylonian Empire rises under Nebuchadnezzar II. He campaigns west, subjugates Judah, and makes it a vassal state. When Judah's king Zedekiah rebels, Nebuchadnezzar returns with an army. The siege begins in January of 588 BCE. Jerusalem holds for 30 months. Food runs out, disease spreads. Starvation becomes so severe that the prophet Jeremiah records mothers eating their children. In July of 586 BCE, Babylonian forces breach the walls. Zedekiah tries to flee, but he is captured. Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers execute Zedekiah's sons in front of him, then gouge out his eyes. The last thing Zedekiah sees is his children dying. He is dragged to Babylon in chains. Nebuzaradan, Nebuchadnezzar's captain of the guard. His orders are clear. Destroy the city and the temple. Burn it all. Leave nothing that could inspire resistance or become a rallying point. On the 9th of Avi, Tisha B'Av in the Hebrew calendar, 586 BCE, soldiers enter the temple. They strip the gold first. Practical men doing practical work. Peel it from walls with tools, from doors with crowbars, from furnishings with hammers and chisels. Sheets of gold, nails of gold, overlay of gold that took craftsmen years to apply comes off in hours. The bronze pillars, Jachin and Boaz, symbols of strength and establishment, are broken into manageable pieces and hauled to Babylon for scrap or display. The molten sea is shattered, its bronze oxen toppled. Bronze stands, pots, every implement, taken or destroyed. Nothing sacred is spared, nothing functional remains. Then fire. Cedar paneling, dry after centuries, burns fast and hot. The roof collapses in a roar of flame and falling beams. Limestone cracks in the heat, stones exploding from thermal shock. Supports fail. Interior walls buckle. The structure that took 7 years and 183,000 workers to build is rubble in a day, smoke rising over Jerusalem like a funeral pyre for a nation. The human toll is staggering. 2 Kings says Nebuzaradan executes the high priest Sariah, the deputy priest, and 3 doorkeepers. He takes temple officials and city leaders to Riblah, where Nebuchadnezzar has them all executed. Then comes the deportation. 10,000 to 18,000 people, the text varies, are marched to Babylon. Not the poor, not the farmers, the elite, the craftsmen, the educated, anyone who could lead a rebuilding. Nebuchadnezzar's strategy is deliberate. Take the knowledge base, leave the land populated by the poorest who can barely farm, and the nation cannot recover. The policy works. Judah becomes a wasteland. Jerusalem, a ruin. The Ark of the Covenant vanishes. It is not listed among the items taken to Babylon. It is not mentioned in later texts. 2nd Maccabees, written centuries later, claims Jeremiah hid it in a cave on Mount Nebo. The Talmud suggests King Josiah, foreseeing disaster, hid it in tunnels beneath the temple. Ethiopian tradition claims it was taken to Aksum by Menelik, Solomon's alleged son with the Queen of Sheba, centuries before the siege. Modern scholars assume it was destroyed, but no one knows. The single most sacred object in Israelite religion, the box containing the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, the physical throne of God's presence, vanishes from history on the 9th of Av, 586 BCE. 70 years pass. Babylon falls to Persia. Cyrus the Great issues an edict in 538. Jews can return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. It is one of history's great reversals. 42,360 exiles make the journey. They are led by Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, appointed governor by Persia, and Joshua the high priest. They reach Jerusalem and find ruins. Walls broken, houses collapsed. The temple platform is a field of charred stone and weeds. They lay the foundation for a new temple in 536 BCE. The moment is described in Ezra chapter 3. Young people shout for joy. Old men, the ones who remember Solomon's temple, weep aloud. The weeping and the shouting are so loud no one can distinguish them. The sound travels for miles. It is the sound of hope mixed with loss. The new temple will never match the first. No gold overlay, no bronze sea, and critically, no ark. The Holy of Holies will be empty except for a stone where the ark once sat. According to tradition, the divine presence itself, the Shekinah, will never fully return. Construction drags. Local opposition halts work for years. The Persian court has to be petitioned. Finally, in 516 BCE, the second temple is completed. 70 years after the first one burned, exactly as Jeremiah prophesied. The structure is modest. The rituals resume. Sacrifices are offered. Pilgrims come for festivals. But everyone knows this temple is a shadow. It stands for nearly 500 years. Then Herod the Great, the Roman client king of Judea, decides to make his mark. In 20 or 19 BCE, Herod begins a renovation so massive it is effectively a new building. His goal is to turn the Second Temple into the grandest religious structure in the Roman world. The scale is staggering. Herod doubles the temple platform from 17 to 36 acres by building massive retaining walls and filling the expanded area with rubble and soil. The western wall, the Kotel, where Jews pray today, is part of Herod's retaining wall. Not the temple itself, but the platform's edge. Herod uses stones so large they defy belief. The western stone weighs 567 tons and measures 44 feet long, 11 feet high, and 16 feet deep. How workers quarried, transported, and set stones that size without modern equipment is still debated. Herod employs 10,000 laborers and trains 1,000 priests as masons, so ritually pure hands can work on sacred areas. Daily sacrifices continue uninterrupted throughout. The temple proper is finished in a year and a half. The full complex, courtyards, porticos, and all structures takes over 80 years. It is completed in 63 or 64 CE. The historian Josephus, who saw it before its destruction, writes that the temple's outward face wanted nothing to surprise men's minds or their eyes. It was covered with plates of gold of great weight. At sunrise, it reflected light so fiercely that people had to look away as they would from the sun's own rays. The Babylonian Talmud says he who has not seen Herod's temple has never seen a beautiful building. For a brief moment, the temple is everything Solomon's was and more. Larger, grander, and more technically sophisticated. Pilgrims flood Jerusalem for festivals. The temple treasury holds donations from Jews across the Roman world. The priesthood runs a complex operation, overseeing sacrifices, managing funds, and maintaining purity laws. Then Rome tires of Jewish unrest. Tensions build through the 1st century. Taxes, corruption, messianic movements, and Roman heavy-handedness create a powder keg. In 66 CE, it explodes. The First Jewish-Roman War begins. By 70 CE, 4 Roman legions under Titus, son of Emperor Vespasian, lay siege to Jerusalem. The siege starts during Passover. The city is packed with pilgrims, swelling the population to perhaps 600,000. The Romans build a circumvallation wall 7 kilometers long in 3 days. Nobody gets out. Famine sets in. Josephus claims a woman named Mary kills and eats her infant. Whether literal or symbolic, the detail conveys the horror. By August, the Romans breach the walls. Fighting is brutal. Priests continue rituals inside the temple even as soldiers close in. Some priests throw themselves into the flames rather than surrender. On the 9th of Av, the same Hebrew date the first temple burned, the second temple catches fire. Accounts differ on whether Titus ordered it or a soldier acted independently. Either way, it burns. Stone cracks, gold melts and runs into cracks between stones. Looters will later pry up paving stones trying to extract every trace of gold. Josephus estimates 1,100,000 die in the siege. Modern scholars think that number is inflated, but still accept several 100,000 deaths. 97,000 are taken prisoner. Many are sent to arenas for gladiatorial combat. Others are sold as slaves. Some are forced to build the Colosseum in Rome. Titus parades the temple's treasures through Rome in 71 CE. The golden menorah, the table of showbread, silver trumpets, and sacred vessels are displayed before cheering crowds. An arch is built to commemorate the victory. The Arch of Titus still stands. Carved on its inner walls is a relief showing Roman soldiers carrying the menorah. For centuries, Rome's chief rabbinate forbade Jews to walk under the arch. The ban lifts only after Israel's founding in 1948. The State of Israel adopts the menorah from the arch as its official emblem. An image of stolen treasure becomes a symbol of return. What happened to the treasures? The menorah and other items likely went to Rome's Temple of Peace. They may have been looted when Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 or when Vandals took the city in 455. Some theories place them in the Vatican vaults. Most historians assume they were melted down long ago for the bullion. The temple platform was left in ruin, and Emperor Hadrian later built a Roman temple to Jupiter on the site, adding insult to devastation. Jews were banned from Jerusalem except one day a year, Tisha B'Av, when they were allowed to approach the ruins and mourn. Fast forward 2,000 years. The temple has not been rebuilt. The platform where it stood is now called the Temple Mount by Jews and Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, by Muslims. The Dome of the Rock, completed in 691 CE, sits where the temple likely stood. Al-Aqsa Mosque occupies the southern part of the platform. The site is the third holiest in Islam after Mecca and Medina, and the holiest in Judaism. That collision of claims has made the Temple Mount one of the most contested pieces of ground on Earth. Since 1967, Israel has controlled security. Jordan, through the Islamic Waqf, controls daily administration. An informal status quo has held for decades. Muslims can pray on the Mount. Jews and Christians can visit, but not pray. That status quo is fraying. In January 2025, Israeli police allowed Jewish visitors to bring prayer sheets for the first time. In August 2025, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir openly led prayers at the site, the first Israeli government minister to do so publicly. Jewish visits have spiked, over 3,500 visited on Tisha B'Av 2025 alone. Reports claim the shofar, the ram's horn blown on Jewish holy days, was sounded on the Mount for the first time in 2,000 years. Meanwhile, some religious Jews have been actively preparing for a third temple. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem has recreated over 100 ritual objects according to biblical specifications, including a golden menorah worth $3 million, priestly garments, silver trumpets, and an incense altar. In 2014, they crowdfunded architectural blueprints. In August 2025, they posted on social media, "Synchronize your watches, it's time to build." Then there is the red heifer issue. The Book of Numbers chapter 19 requires the ashes of a red heifer without defect for purification rites before priests can serve in the temple. According to tradition, only 9 red heifers have been sacrificed from Moses to 70 CE. The 10th will be sacrificed by the Messiah. In September 2022, 5 red heifers were flown from Texas to Israel, donated by evangelical Christian ranchers who see this as fulfilling prophecy. The heifers are being raised at a settlement near Shiloh. 4 remain unblemished. Hamas explicitly cited the red heifers as one factor in the October 7, 2023 attack, calling them a provocation. Evangelical Christians, particularly dispensationalists, believe a third temple must be built for end times prophecy to unfold. Key passages include Daniel chapter 9, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and Revelation chapter 11. They see the temple as necessary for the Antichrist to desecrate before Christ's return, and many actively fund organizations preparing for construction. But most Jews, including the Israeli chief rabbinate, oppose building a third temple now. Mainstream Orthodox belief holds the temple should be rebuilt in the Messianic era by divine action, not human initiative. Conservative Judaism supports the concept but rejects animal sacrifices. Reform Judaism largely opposes rebuilding, viewing temple-era worship as primitive. Archaeology has found limited direct evidence of Solomon's temple. The Temple Mount has never been fully excavated. Religious and political sensitivities prevent extensive digs. Muslim authorities control the site and oppose excavation, fearing it would bolster Jewish claims. In 1999, the Waqf illegally removed 9,000 tons of debris during construction and dumped it in the Kidron Valley. The Temple Mount Sifting Project has since recovered over 635,000 artifacts from that debris, including items from the First Temple period, such as pottery shards, seal impressions, and stone weights. In 2023, archaeologists announced the first artifacts conclusively dated to Solomon's era found in situ on the mount: olive pits, animal bones, and ceramic fragments. It is not much, but it is the first physical proof from the right period at the right location. The scholarly debate is fierce. Minimalists like Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University argue Solomon was little more than a hill country chieftain and that 10th century Jerusalem was barely a village. Maximalists like Yosef Garfinkel of Hebrew University point to recent finds at sites like Khirbet Qeiyafa and argue they prove a centralized, urbanized kingdom under Solomon. Most scholars land in the middle. The temple probably existed by the Babylonian period, but its size, wealth, and the scale of Solomon's kingdom are likely exaggerated in the biblical text. The question is not whether there was a temple. It is whether it looked like the Bible says, and whether the cost was as staggering as the numbers suggest. So what did Solomon's temple really cost? If the biblical figures are literal, we are talking $140 billion and up in gold alone, plus silver, bronze, labor, and materials. Total cost could exceed $300 billion, more than any building project in history, until perhaps the modern Saudi expansions of Mecca's Grand Mosque. If the numbers are symbolic, the cost drops to perhaps $3 to $6 billion, still monumental. Compare that to the Burj Khalifa at $1.5 billion, or St. Peter's Basilica at an inflation-adjusted $33 billion. Either way, Solomon spent a kingdom's wealth on a building 90 feet long. And then there is the human cost. 183,000 workers, most forced, many enslaved, families broken, lives shortened by brutal labor, no accounting of deaths or injuries. The temple's beauty came at a price paid in flesh and freedom and the political cost. Forced labor splits the kingdom. 10 tribes leave. The united monarchy ends. Civil strife follows. Both kingdoms weaken. Both will eventually fall. The temple, in some sense, destroys the nation that built it. And for what? For a building that stands less than 4 centuries before burning. For a second version that, even renovated by Herod, lasts only 600 years total. For treasures looted, melted, lost to history. For a site that today cannot be touched without risking regional war. The temple was meant to be eternal. It was meant to make God's presence permanent in Israel, to centralize worship, to awe the nations. It succeeded at the last part. But permanence? 2 destructions on the same calendar date, both catastrophic, suggest permanence was never in the plan. Many Christians read the destruction as prophetic. Jesus stands in Herod's temple and tells his disciples not one stone will be left on another. 40 years later, it is ash. The Apostle Paul writes that believers' bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit. The author of Hebrews argues Christ's sacrifice makes the temple system obsolete. Christianity shifts the temple from a building to a person, then to a community. Many Jews read the destruction as exile from God's presence. For 2,000 years, prayers end with next year in Jerusalem. The longing is liturgical, baked into daily worship, the ache for a building that no longer exists. So who paid for Solomon's temple? Workers who bled. Canaanites enslaved. Israelites conscripted. Hiram of Tyre supplied timber and craft, reimbursed in grain and gold. Solomon spent inherited wealth. The kingdom paid with fractured unity. Future generations paid with exile and longing. And arguably, God's reputation. A God who demands gold overlay, forced labor, and extravagant sacrifice begins to look less like a deity and more like an ancient Near Eastern king obsessed with status. The text itself seems aware of this tension. Solomon's prayer at the dedication asks the uncomfortable question, can God, infinite and everywhere, really be contained in a building? The question is never answered. The glory comes down, the fire consumes the sacrifice. But the question hangs. How much does this dream cost today? In dollars, anywhere from $3 billion to $300 billion, depending on interpretation. In lives, uncountable. In political stability, a kingdom. In longing, 2 millennia. In controversy, ongoing. In prophecy, unfulfilled or yet to be fulfilled, depending on belief. The temple became the most expensive building project of the ancient world and maybe of all time. It became the center of a religion. It became the symbol of loss and hope. It became a battlefield. 3 religions claim it. 2 have structures on its ruins. 1 wants to rebuild. The lesson cuts both ways. Monuments demand sacrifice. The question is whether the sacrifice serves the divine or just the human hunger for permanence, for proof, for something to point at and say, God was here. Solomon built proof. Twice it burned. The grandeur was real. The cost was real. The destruction was real. The longing is real. And somewhere beneath the dome of the rock, beneath Muslim prayer, Jewish yearning, and Christian theology, the question remains. If the temple rises again, who will pay this time? If you found this investigation valuable, please like this video and subscribe. Your support makes detailed biblical investigations possible. Tell me in the comments what biblical structure or story we should examine next. The Tower of Babel, Noah's Ark, the walls of Jericho, or perhaps something unexpected. These are not just ancient stories, they are blueprints of power, costs paid in lives, and questions we still have not answered. Every monument has its shadows, every dream, its price. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next investigation.